I don't know why I'm recording this. Maybe it's just a way to make sense of what happened, or what I think happened, that night up at Klingman's Hollow. Some stories won't sit quietly in your head. They scratch at the walls until you give them a voice. I've been a ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains for almost 20 years. I've seen the forest in every season. The way the fog clings to the ridgelines in April, the black bears moving like shadows through the huckleberries, the sound of cicadas swelling into something almost holy at dusk. It's a place that humbles you, reminds you that you're just another passing thing. When you spend enough time out here, you start to believe the forest has moods. It's not superstition. You feel it, the way the air grows heavier before a storm, or how the birds go silent right before sunset when something big moves in the undergrowth. You learn to listen, and you learn not to question what you hear. That November, the department assigned me to close down one of the higher campgrounds for winter, an old site called Deep Creek Hollow near the North Carolina line. It used to be a popular spot years ago before the floods washed out the access road and half the facilities rotted away. They never reopened it officially, but every fall, we still had to make the rounds, lock up the gates, pull the trash bins, make sure no late-season campers were squatting there. I'd done the job a dozen times before. It's boring work, mostly. Long drives, damp air, the smell of pine sap stuck to your clothes. But that year felt different. The forest had been unusually quiet since late October. Even the usual campers and hunters had cleared out early, spooked by reports of coyotes or maybe a black bear moving through. The air had that brittle stillness, the kind that makes you feel like you're being watched even when you're alone. I set out just before dusk. The access road wound up through the trees like a scar, cracked and narrow, barely wide enough for the truck. The fog was already forming low along the valley, rolling in off the creek. I remember how the headlights caught the mist, these pale, shifting columns that looked almost alive. I turned off the radio halfway up. The static was getting worse the higher I went, and I've learned not to fight the quiet in these mountains. You either let it in or it'll drive you crazy. By the time I reached the gate, it was full dark. The air was cold enough to frost my breath. The campground sat about a mile beyond, 30 old campsites scattered around a loop, each with a fire ring and a picnic table that the forest had half swallowed back into itself. I parked by the ranger shed, grabbed my flashlight, and started the walkthrough. That's when I first heard it. It wasn't much, just this faint sound drifting through the trees. At first I thought it was wind, but it had rhythm to it. Laughter, maybe? The kind that carries far when the air is still. I stopped and listened. The beam from my flashlight barely touched the nearest tree trunks. Beyond that, just fog and silence. Then, there it was again. A low, distant chuckle followed by what sounded like the crack of a campfire. I remember checking my watch. It was just after 7. No cars, no lights, no sign of anyone at the gate. I called out, "Park ranger, anyone out there?" And my voice came back thin and small. Nothing answered. It's not unusual to find drifters or hunters camping illegally, especially this time of year. But the sound, there was something wrong about it. It wasn't coming from one direction. It seemed to move, behind me, then off to the right, then somewhere up the slope, as if the forest itself was carrying it around. I told myself it was an echo, maybe a creak or the wind bouncing off the ridge. But the smell reached me next, faint wood smoke carried on the fog, and under it, something else. Something sweet, like burned syrup. I followed it. Against my better judgment, I started down the trail toward the old lower loop where the campsites had been abandoned first after the floods. The ground there is soft and uneven, covered in pine needles and half-buried stones. My boots crunched louder than I liked. The laughter had stopped by then, just the sound of my breathing and the drip of condensation from the branches. Every few steps I'd catch that scent again. The smoke, the sweetness. It reminded me of an old sugar shack fire I once saw as a kid, the way the sap boiled and turned black when left too long. When I reached the first campsite, the fog was so thick I could barely see the fire ring. It was empty, just a ring of damp stones. The picnic table was warped, the bench half collapsed. I swept my flashlight slowly across the clearing. For a second, I thought I saw someone sitting there, a shape maybe, just beyond the beam. But when I moved the light back, there was nothing. I stood still, listening. And that's when I heard the crackle again. Not close, but not far either. Another fire. Another laugh. You know that feeling when you realize you're being drawn in, like the forest is pulling you deeper without you noticing? That's what it felt like. Each sound seemed to lead to the next, always just out of reach. By the time I came to the last site on the lower loop, I could see it, a faint orange glow flickering behind the fog. I called out again, louder this time, trying to sound in control. "Park ranger, this area is closed." No answer. I stepped into the clearing. The fire was burning low, mostly embers, but it was real. Heat radiating against the cold night air. There were 3 camping chairs set up around it, old folding ones, the kind you buy cheap at gas stations. One had fallen over. The other 2 were facing each other, and between them a tin coffee pot sat in the ash, blackened and dented. But there was no one there. No bags, no tent, no footprints in the dirt. Just the fire, still burning like it had been tended to only moments before. I remember crouching down, holding my hand near the embers. They were hot, too hot for a fire that had been left alone. I stirred them with a stick. Beneath the ash, the coals glowed red, fresh. Someone had been there, maybe minutes before I arrived. Then I heard the radio. It was faint at first, just static, a whisper of a voice cutting through. I reached for my shoulder mic, but it wasn't mine. The sound was coming from somewhere in the woods, maybe 50 feet away. A broken signal, like a handheld set stuck on transmit. I turned off my flashlight and waited. The static grew louder, then stopped. And in the silence that followed, I heard a voice, soft, calm, almost familiar. "Don't stay here," it said. Then nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed there longer than I should have. I don't know why. Maybe it was disbelief, the kind that keeps you standing still even when every instinct says to move. The fire, the chairs, the voice, it all felt too staged, too deliberate, like I'd walked into someone else's memory. I swept the beam of my flashlight around the clearing again. The fog swallowed the light almost instantly, but for a second I caught sight of something on one of the trees, a marking, carved deep into the bark, not initials, not a date. Just a symbol, a rough spiral, half filled in like someone had started carving and stopped. The wood around it was fresh, not weathered. I took a photo on my phone, though the mist blurred everything. Then I turned back toward the fire. That's when I noticed the footprints. They weren't clear, but the soil was soft enough to hold impressions. Bare feet. Small ones. 3 or 4 sets circling the fire pit. I tried to count them, but the ground was uneven and half covered in needles. Still, I could make out the toes, too small to be adult, but too wide to be a child's. Almost. Human, but not. A branch snapped behind me. I spun the light toward the sound, heart hammering. Nothing but fog and empty space. I called out again. My voice cracked this time. No answer. The forest has a way of listening back to you. When you speak out here, your words don't just fade. They hang, echo, dissolve into the mist. It's like the woods decide whether to give them back or not. That night, it kept them. I made the call on my radio, trying to sound calm. "Dispatch. This is Ranger 2-1 at Deep Creek Hollow. I've got signs of an active fire and possible trespassers, requesting verification on access logs." There was a pause, just static. Then the dispatcher's voice came through, faint and delayed. "Copy 2-1, you said Deep Creek Hollow?" "Affirmative. I'm at Lower Loop. Found recent activity. Can you confirm any campers permitted past gate this week?" Another long pause, more static. Then, "Negative on that. That site's been closed since." The transmission cut out. I adjusted the antenna, stepped away from the fire to higher ground, tried again. "Repeat, dispatch. You're cutting out. What did you say about the site?" "Nothing." Then the line came back, a whisper buried under static. "That campground's been closed for years." And then, silence. My first thought was that she'd misheard me. Maybe the frequency had bled with another channel. Maybe she thought I'd said the old Deep Creek North, the one that shut down after the landslide. But I'd read the log myself that morning. Deep Creek Hollow was still on the winter closure list, not decommissioned. It didn't make sense. I started back toward the main loop, fast. The fog had thickened into something almost solid, a wall of gray that turned my flashlight beam into a useless blur. Every sound was amplified, my boots crunching on gravel, my breathing too loud, the distant drip of water from the trees. Halfway up the trail, I stopped. Someone was humming. It was faint, female maybe, drifting through the trees. The same tune I'd heard sometimes from families in the campgrounds. Something simple, like a lullaby. I froze and listened. It was coming from the direction of the old ranger shed. I wanted to call out, but my throat locked. The sound didn't feel right. It wasn't coming from one spot. It seemed to move with the fog, fading and reappearing, never closer, never farther. Then I caught sight of a dim glow ahead. The shed light. I hadn't left it on. When I reached the door, the humming stopped. The air inside was cold, the kind that feels wet against your skin. My flashlight caught dust floating through the air, thick enough to make a haze. Everything was just as I'd left it earlier. The workbench, the maintenance log, the old coffee thermos. Except for one thing. On the wall above the desk, someone had pinned an old map of the campground, the kind printed years ago before the flood changed the terrain. But this one had markings in red ink, small circles around several campsites, numbers written beside them. I traced the loops with my finger. Each circle matched the location of the fires I'd passed over the years, the places where we'd found remnants of illegal camps, hunters, sometimes missing persons searches. And the last circle, drawn heavier than the rest, was right where I stood. I sat down on the bench without meaning to. The wood was damp. My hands were shaking. I told myself it was just a prank. Some teenager found an old map, snuck up here, thought they'd scare the ranger, but the ink, it hadn't bled. It looked fresh. I turned on the radio again, cycling through frequencies, static on every channel. Then, buried in the noise, I heard breathing. Slow, steady, human. I pressed the mic. Dispatch, copy if you can hear me. The breathing stopped, and then a man's voice, not the dispatcher's. You shouldn't be here. I dropped the radio. The sound echoed off the walls, metallic and sharp. I picked it up again, but the channel was dead, only the hum of open static. That was the first time I thought about leaving. Driving back down to the gate, writing it off as an equipment malfunction, coming back in the morning with another ranger. But some part of me, maybe the same stubborn part that kept me in this job all these years, didn't want to leave without an explanation. I went outside again. The fog was thicker now, swirling slow, almost like it was alive. The trees leaned inward, their tops lost in gray. The forest felt smaller somehow, like it had folded in around the campground. As I stood there listening, I realized something. The night was too quiet, no wind, no crickets, not even the distant rush of the creek. And then, faint at first, almost too soft to notice, came the sound of footsteps, not one set. Several. Moving along the gravel road behind me, slow and deliberate, I called out, "Ranger Service, identify yourself." The steps stopped. I turned the flashlight toward the sound, the beam cutting through the fog. Nothing. And then, from somewhere just beyond the reach of the light, a whisper. "You were here before." I don't remember dropping the flashlight, but it hit the ground, the beam spinning wild through the mist. I caught a glimpse of something pale, like a face, or maybe just fog curling the right way, and then it was gone. The whisper came again, closer this time. "You came back." I ran. I didn't think, didn't plan. I just ran. Up the path, past the overgrown fire pits, the empty picnic tables, the fog dragging at my legs like water. I didn't stop until I saw the faint reflection of the truck's taillights through the mist. I locked the doors, slammed the radio into its mount, and tried the engine. It coughed once, twice, then died. The fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, pale and heavy. I could still hear the footsteps, slow now, circling the truck. And then, faint through the static of the dashboard radio, I heard the same voice as before, only this time it wasn't warning me. It was laughing. I don't know how long I sat there in that truck. maybe a minute, maybe an hour. Time doesn't behave the same way out there. It stretches and folds in on itself, especially when you're alone, especially when you're scared. I kept my hands on the wheel even though the engine was dead. The radio was hissing. The headlights dimmed to a dull glow, and outside, the fog pulsed faintly with light, as if fires were burning far off in the trees. But there couldn't be any fires. Not here. Not now. I reached for the ignition again. The key turned, but the engine didn't catch. Just that slow, dragging sound like something was caught in the gears. I tried again. Nothing. The third time, I stopped midway, because the hissing in the radio had changed. It wasn't static anymore. It was voices, not words at first, just the cadence of conversation, the rhythm of people talking low and fast. Then laughter, that same laughter I'd heard before, drifting through the woods, but this time it was inside the truck. It sounded like it was coming from the speakers, a dozen people whispering over each other, overlapping, too soft to make out individual words. I hit the power switch. The sound didn't stop. I turned the dial, every station the same, voices, whispering, laughing. I turned off the whole dash. Still there. That's when I realized it wasn't the radio at all. The sound was coming from outside, from the fog. It was surrounding the truck now, brushing against the windows. I could see faint shadows moving in it. Not shapes exactly, but distortions, like heat ripples bending the air. I leaned forward, staring into the mist, trying to focus. My breath fogged the glass. And then something tapped against the driver's side window. A single knock. Light, almost polite. I froze. Another knock. I turned my head slowly. Through the fogged glass, I could just make out the outline of a hand, not pressed flat, not clawing, just resting there. I wiped the window with my sleeve. Nothing. The glass was clear. The hand was gone. The laughter outside had stopped, replaced by a low crackling sound, the faint pop of burning wood. And beneath it, something else, a voice so quiet I thought I was imagining it. Come back to the fire. I opened the door before I realized what I was doing. I told myself I needed to verify what I was hearing, to make sense of it, to ground myself in something real. But truthfully, I think part of me was being called. The way certain sounds or places pull at you, not with fear, but with recognition. The air outside was colder than before. The fog glowed faintly as if reflecting a fire that wasn't there. I stepped forward, one hand on my flashlight, though I didn't bother turning it on. The beam only made things worse. The light just bounced back, blinding. So I walked without it, guided by the faint orange shimmer deep in the fog. The forest was utterly silent. No branches cracking, no owls, no sound of my boots on the ground, as if the world was holding its breath. But as I moved farther from the truck, something changed beneath my feet. The gravel gave way to soft dirt, then mud, then something that felt wrong, springy, uneven, like walking on packed leaves and cloth. I shone my light down for just a second. It wasn't leaves, it was canvas. Old tent fabric, half rotted and fused to the soil, and scattered across it were the remains of what must have been a campsite. Rusted cookware, crushed cans, a melted lantern, all of it sunken into the ground like it had been buried there for years. The firelight ahead flickered brighter now, steady and real. I could hear it again, that faint crackle, that warmth. I stepped closer. When I reached the clearing, the fog thinned just enough to show me the fire. It was small, no bigger than a cooking flame, burning low but clean. And sitting around it were three shapes. For a moment I thought they were people. They didn't move, just sat there, their faces dimly lit by the firelight. Then I saw the chairs. They were the same three from before. The one that had fallen over was upright again. The two others faced each other, and in the space between them, the coffee pot sat perfectly centered, steam rising from the spout. I took a step forward. The figures didn't move. I could see them more clearly now. Not people, but shadows cast by the fire, impossibly solid, standing where no one was sitting. And then, as if sensing me, one of them turned its head. It was like watching smoke fold in on itself. The shadow moved, bending with the fog, and though there was no face, I felt the unmistakable weight of being seen. Something inside me cracked open then, that fragile barrier between reason and fear. All the little explanations I'd built through the years, tricks of light, bad radio frequencies, echoes, fell apart. I spoke out loud without meaning to. "Who are you?" No answer. Just that same slow turn of the head, the whisper of movement, and the faint sound of breathing, though it didn't come from any direction I could name. Then I noticed something that chilled me more than the shapes themselves. Behind the fire, barely visible in the gloom, stood the ranger shed. My ranger shed. Only it wasn't the same one I'd left. The boards were darker, warped, as if decades older. The door hung off one hinge and the window was gone. I stepped closer, my heart hammering. The ground was uneven, roots twisting under the soil. Every step I took, the fire dimmed a little more until it was only embers again. When I reached the doorway, the smell hit me. Wood smoke, mold, something sweet and metallic. Inside, the walls were black with soot. The map was still there, but it looked ancient, yellowed, and curling. The ink markings had faded to brown stains. And there on the desk sat a radio. My radio. The same model, the same frequency card taped to the side. Only this one was coated in dust. I reached for it. The knob was stiff, corroded. When I turned it, the static came instantly. Sharp, too loud. Then, through the hiss, a voice. Mine. Deep Creek Hollow. Found recent activity. Can you confirm any campers permitted past gate this week? The words I'd said earlier, playing back exactly, echoing through the static. And then the reply, that campground's been closed for years. The same voice, the same delay. And as the words faded, the static turned into a low hum, rising in pitch until it became almost a scream. I dropped the radio. The sound didn't stop. It filled the whole shed, vibrating the walls, the floor, my chest. I stumbled backward, out the door, into the cold air again. The fire was gone. The fog had lifted. And in its place, dawn light. Faint, gray, the color of ash. I stood there for a long time, trying to understand what I was seeing. The forest was still. The road was visible again, winding down the ridge. The truck sat where I'd left it. Everything was quiet, ordinary, but when I looked back toward the clearing, the one with the fire pit and the chairs, there was nothing. Just moss-covered stones, half buried under leaves. No ashes, no tracks, no sign that anyone had been there in years. I made my way down to the gate without looking back. The radio crackled once, briefly, then went silent again. At the ranger station later that morning, I filed the report. No trespassers found, campsite secure. I didn't mention the fire or the voices or the laughter. I couldn't. There wasn't a way to make it sound real without sounding insane, but I couldn't shake what the dispatcher had said. That campground's been closed for years. So after my shift, I pulled the old archive logs, the closure list from the late 90s. There it was. Deep Creek Hollow, officially closed following multiple disappearances in October 1999. 3 names, 2 adults, 1 child, last seen camping on the lower loop. I tried to forget about Deep Creek Hollow. For a while, I managed to convince myself it was just fatigue or isolation or one of those tricks the mind plays when you spend too much time listening to silence. I'd seen things before in this job, shadows that looked like people, half-heard voices that turned out to be the wind. You learn not to chase everything that moves. But that night never let go of me. It lingered, like the smell of wood smoke that clings to your clothes long after the fire's gone out. A few weeks passed. Winter moved in, slow and heavy. The higher roads froze over. The forest grew quiet in a way that wasn't peaceful anymore, the kind of quiet that hides something beneath it. Then, one evening, I was closing up the ranger station when the night shift came in. A younger guy, fresh out of training, he tossed me a clipboard and said, "Hey, your name's still on this site, inspection next month, Deep Creek Hollow. Should I move it to me?" I told him yes, of course. But when he said the name, I felt something tighten in my chest. I stayed late that night, going through old records more out of compulsion than reason. The files were thin, most of them faded typewritten reports from before I even joined the service. Maintenance logs, closure notices, occasional incident sheets. Then I found it, an internal memo from November 1999. It was short, almost clinical. Open quote, "Closure of Deep Creek Hollow Campground effective immediately." Following the disappearance of 3 visitors, names redacted pending investigation, the site is to remain closed until further notice. Note, reports of continued smoke activity and lights at ranger teams to verify seasonal maintenance only. Close quote, smoke activity, lights at night. The memo was signed by one of the old supervisors, a man I'd met once years ago. He'd retired not long after that. I remembered his hands, always shaking like he'd seen something he couldn't quite put away. That night, I drove home but couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that clearing, the 3 chairs, the fire, the handprint on the glass, the way the voice had said, "You came back." It felt less like a threat now and more like recognition. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I had to go back. I didn't tell anyone. I signed out a truck, packed light, flashlight, camera, my service radio, and an old field recorder I'd used for bird surveys. If I could capture what I'd heard, maybe I could prove to myself it was real, or prove it wasn't. The road was worse this time, half frozen, washed out in places. The fog hadn't lifted in weeks, and the trees were crusted with ice that cracked when the wind shifted. When I reached the gate, the padlock was gone. Just gone. Not broken, not cut, missing. I opened the gate and drove in. The air grew colder as I climbed. The forest around me felt heavier, older. I passed the same landmarks, the bend in the road where the creek crossed, the hollowed log that looked like a bear's den, but they all felt wrong, as if I'd been gone for years, not weeks. By the time I reached the campground, it was late afternoon. The fog was already rising again, rolling down the slopes like a tide. I parked by the ranger shed and left the engine running this time. I told myself I'd only stay a few minutes, just enough to walk the lower loop, check the site, get whatever it was out of my system. The shed door creaked open easily. Inside, the same smell hit me. Damp, wood, dust, something sweet underneath. The map was still pinned to the wall. No red markings this time, just blank. I turned on the field recorder, clipped it to my jacket, and started down the trail. The fog thickened quickly, swallowing the trees one by one. The air felt charged, that same methane metallica pressure before a storm. I reached the first site, then the second. Nothing. Just old fire rings, leaves, the skeletal remains of picnic tables. When I got to the third site, the one where I'd seen the fire, I stopped. Something was different. The ground was bare, cleared of debris. The stones of the fire ring had been arranged neatly, as if someone had cleaned it. And at the center, a single object lay half buried in the dirt. A coffee pot, the same dented tin one I'd seen before. I crouched down, brushed the dirt off, turned it over. It was cold but dry inside, no rust, no moss, as if it had been placed there recently. That's when the recorder picked up the first sound. At first, I thought it was feedback, a low hum, almost below hearing. Then it rose, slowly, forming words, a man's voice, my voice. Open quote, "You shouldn't be here." Close quote. I froze. The recorder kept playing, though I hadn't stopped or rewound it. The voice grew louder, clearer. Open quote, "Don't stay here. You came back." Close quote. The same phrases. Over and over, layered on top of each other, distorted by static. I turned it off. The forest was silent. Then, faint laughter. Behind me. I spun around, shining the light through the fog. Nothing. Just trees. But then the light caught something pale on the ground, half hidden by leaves. I stepped closer. It was a photograph, face down in the mud. I picked it up. It was water-damaged, faded, but I could still make out the image. A man and a woman sitting by a campfire, smiling. A child between them, holding a tin coffee pot. Behind them, 3 folding chairs. I turned it over. On the back, in smeared ink, Deep Creek Hollow, October 99. My stomach dropped. The wind shifted, carrying that same faint sweetness, smoke and sugar. And from somewhere behind me, a child's voice whispered, "We never left." The flashlight flickered. Then the fog lit up. Everywhere around me, in the trees, small fires flared, dozens of them, like eyes blinking open. Each one burned low and steady, casting long shadows that swayed like people standing just out of sight. The radio on my shoulder crackled to life. "Ranger 2-1, status check," a voice said. But it wasn't dispatch, it was mine. Playback. I dropped the coffee pot and ran. The fires didn't fade, they followed. Every direction I turned, the glow reappeared ahead of me. The trail seemed to loop back on itself, the same fallen log, the same tree with the spiral carving. My breathing was ragged. I could hear footsteps again, light, soft, like bare feet on wet earth. And then, just when I thought I was losing it completely, a shape appeared through the fog. A person, standing in the middle of the trail, facing me. A man in a ranger's jacket, mine. He looked older, thinner, eyes hollow like he hadn't slept in years, and when he spoke his voice was mine too. "You can't keep closing it," he said. "It doesn't stay closed." I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't listen. He stepped closer, the fog curling around him, the same spiral symbol burned into his sleeve. "It's not them that stay," he said. "It's us." Then he was gone. The fog swallowed everything, the firelight, the trail, the sound. When I came to, I was sitting in the truck, engine idling, dawn breaking gray through the trees. I don't remember how I got there. The gate was locked behind me when I left. That was months ago. The department's since reassigned me. Desk work mostly, but sometimes when the radio's quiet at night, I still hear the faintest static on an empty channel. A voice, distant and patient, saying things I can't quite make out. And every now and then, I catch the smell of wood smoke drifting through the vents, faint, sweet, impossible. I've stopped trying to explain it. The forest doesn't owe us reason? It never did. We build our maps, draw our boundaries, hang our signs that say closed for the season. But out there, the seasons never really end. The fires keep burning somewhere deep in the mist, and the laughter drifts just far enough that you can tell yourself it's memory. But it's not. It's the sound of the forest remembering you. It's been 3 years now. The mountains look the same on paper, same coordinates, same tree lines. But when I drive through the Smokies these days, something always feels just slightly out of focus. Like I'm looking at a photograph that was taken twice, and one image didn't quite line up with the other. The new rangers don't know much about Deep Creek Hollow. It's not on their maps anymore. The file disappeared from the system not long after I left field duty. But sometimes when a storm moves through, they'll report strange interference on the radio, faint signals, distorted voices. One kid said he heard a man asking for backup from a site that doesn't exist. They laugh about it. Static ghosts, they call them. But every time I hear that term, I feel something twist deep inside me. Because I know that's not how it starts. It starts quiet. It starts as something you almost recognize. I still have the field recorder. It shouldn't have survived. Moisture, cold, the fall I must have taken that night. But it did. Most of the audio is dead air, except for one stretch near the middle, maybe 20 seconds long. You can hear footsteps, heavy breathing, wind through trees, then a faint voice, my voice, whispering, "You came back." And right after that, something I didn't hear in the moment. Another voice, softer. "So did we." I don't play it often, only when I forget what I heard. Only when I start to think maybe none of it was real. But the forest remembers things we don't. Sometimes I wonder what really happened to the people in that photograph, the family, the child, if they ever really vanished or if they just stayed. There's a part of me that thinks they never meant to scare anyone. Maybe they were just waiting for someone to notice, to remember them. Maybe that's what hauntings really are, not vengeance, not evil, but memory with nowhere else to go. The longer I've sat with it, the more I've come to believe that some places keep what we leave behind. Our laughter, our fear, our voices calling out to be heard. And the more we ignore them, the more we pretend the land is just background for our stories, the louder they whisper. I haven't gone back. I won't. But sometimes when I drive past the old forest road at dusk, I pull over, just for a minute. I sit there with the engine off, and the world around me fills with that stillness, that heavy, endless quiet that presses against your ribs, and somewhere deep inside that silence I can almost hear it, a faint crackle, like a fire just beginning to take, a child's laughter, soft as the wind through pine needles, a man's voice, low and patient, not accusing, just waiting. People ask why I never transferred out of this region, why I stay near the same mountains that nearly took everything from me. I tell them the truth, because the forest doesn't scare me anymore. Not the way it used to. I've come to understand that fear is just the sound of something trying to speak to you. And when you finally stop running long enough to listen, really listen, sometimes what you hear isn't darkness. It's history. It's belonging. I think about that often, especially when the younger rangers joke about the haunted hollow. I smile, but I never correct them, because I know the forest doesn't care what we call it. It only cares that we remember. So if you ever find yourself driving through the Great Smokies at night and the fog settles low over the road, if you see an old campground sign half buried in moss, don't stop. But if you do stop, if you feel that quiet pull and hear the faint pop of a fire that shouldn't exist, just listen. And if you hear someone whisper your name from the trees, don't be afraid. It's probably not calling you in. It's probably just saying, thank you. The forest keeps its stories. We just have to decide whether we're part of them or just passing through. I remember the first morning I stood atop the fire watchtower, shivering under a sky so vast it seemed to stretch my fear thin. My name is Garrett, 24 years old at the time, a rookie ranger with a license to patrol one of the most unforgiving parts of Shoshone National Forest in Wyoming. The world beneath me was a quilt of deep pines, scattered clearings, and ridges that rolled into the horizon like the ocean in slow motion. I had been trained to see danger in its physical form, fallen trees, erratic weather, careless campers, but the forest seemed to have another curriculum altogether, one written in the rustle of branches and the whisper of wind through needles. The tower itself was older than any ranger in the district could remember. Wooden planks warped with age, the metal staircase creaking under my weight as I ascended. They called it Tower 17, though names and numbers never seemed to matter much here. You learn quickly that the forest keeps its own ledger. It remembers the fire scars, the lost hikers, and the moments when the earth itself seems to breathe around you. On that first morning, the air smelled of frost and wet pine, something ancient that made the skin at the back of my neck crawl. I thought I was prepared. I wasn't. It started quietly with the radio. A crackle first, then words, soft, hurried, and strangely formal. I wasn't expecting contact that early. Another tower, Tower 11, a station that had been struck by lightning and burned to its skeletal frame decades before, was broadcasting a daily report. Static punctuated the sentences, and sometimes the voice seemed to pause mid-thought, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. At first, I assumed it was interference. Radio echoes happen, but the reports were always exact, giving conditions, temperature, wind speed, smoke sightings, but sometimes inexplicably including notes that didn't make sense. Ash is moving, the ridge feels wrong, footfalls in the hollow. I laughed once when I wrote those last phrases down. I told myself that a rookie ranger gets scared, imagines patterns, anthropomorphizes the forest. But the forest didn't need my permission to be alive. The sun rose over jagged peaks, illuminating ridges so steep and lonely I could almost see the air itself falling. Birds moved in tight flocks, not in songs, but in harsh, chattering bursts. Each one seemed like a warning. I would have been foolish to ignore them. By the third day, the voice on the radio had begun speaking directly to me. It knew my name. I didn't tell anyone. I wasn't sure anyone would believe me. But hearing my own name called through static at dawn from a tower that had ceased to exist made me question everything I thought I understood about reality. I started to write the messages down, every word, every pause. Sometimes there were instructions, seemingly mundane. Check the south ridge for smoke, monitor the creek near the old clearing. Other times it was almost conversational. Do you see it yet? The rational part of me, trained to act, to protect, to measure risk, fought against the absurdity. A tower burned decades ago cannot send radio messages. The forest is not a sentient being. Logic, however, is fragile in the presence of repeated contradiction. I began hiking daily, following the instructions as if obeying a guardian, even though each step drew me deeper into a territory that smelled of old fire and something else, something organic and damp, something that made my stomach twist. The first hike to the ruins of Tower 11 was uneventful in a way. The forest pressed against me on all sides, needles scratching at my sleeves, branches whipping my face. I felt watched, though I never saw anyone. No other ranger, no hiker, nothing human. When I reached the charred remnants, the silence was so complete it hummed. But there were footprints. Fresh ash disturbed. They weren't mine, and they weren't old. They were there, ghostly imprints pressed into the blackened soil, leading to and from the tower like someone had been pacing, waiting for me. I froze. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, and then, in the distance, I thought I heard a low grunt, something between a cough and a growl. It was gone before I could locate it. Rational thought whispered, "It's an animal." Bears, mountain lions, elk, any of them could have left tracks, could have made noise. But the footprints didn't match any paw I'd ever learned to track. They were too long, too wide, too deliberate. Each step, I realized with a sudden icy certainty, was meant to be noticed. That night, back in my own tower, I stared at the dark silhouette of the forest, listening to the wind and the ever-present radio crackle. I tried to sleep, but the mind is a terrible servant in places like this. Every creak of wood became a warning, every groan of wind through the trees a potential intruder. The forest seemed to breathe in time with me, whispering doubts and half-formed fears. I closed my eyes and tried to tell myself it was just adrenaline. A rookie mistake. Sleep would reset me. But sleep did not come easily. I awoke hours later to the faintest smell of smoke, though the day had been clear with no fire reported. My radio sputtered again, and I heard my name, softer this time, like a warning. "Don't step beyond the clearing." I did not move. I could not. My body had surrendered to the forest in a way I had never experienced before. The smell of smoke thickened, almost like it was pressing against my skin, against my lungs. I remembered the footprints in the ash, the empty charred tower, and the low grunt that had echoed across the ridge. And for the first time, I truly understood that fear is not always born from sight, but from anticipation, from the mind's ability to perceive patterns in absence. The following days were worse. The radio messages became more insistent, sometimes urgent, sometimes personal. "Garrett, the hollow waits, do not linger." I did not reply. How could I? There was no one to reply to, and yet the forest compelled me to act, to follow. Every day I hiked the paths, checked the south ridge, the old creek, the clearing. Each step was calculated, cautious, but always tinged with dread. The footprints were always there, fresh in the ash, vanishing when I reached them, as if mocking my presence. One afternoon, as the wind carried a sharp chill through the pines, I found a single shoe. A child's shoe, half buried in ash, unsoiled by time. It was white, grimy, burned along one edge. There was no other sign of a child, no clothing, no belongings, just the shoe. And beneath it, the faint outline of footprints that did not belong to any human or animal I knew. My hands trembled as I lifted the shoe. The radio was silent then, but I knew it had been waiting for me to notice, waiting for me to acknowledge the forest's ledger. By this time, the psychological strain was undeniable. My reflection in the window of the tower was gaunt, pale, eyes shadowed. Colleagues noticed my absences, the erratic reports, the way I avoided the forest floor, preferring the height of the tower. I wanted to speak, to tell someone, but how could I explain a burned tower sending messages, footprints in ash that shouldn't exist, a shoe buried with intent? I feared the words themselves would be the proof of my unraveling. I began keeping a small journal, recording every detail, every sound, every smell, every shadow, as though cataloging evidence against my own disbelief. The forest became more oppressive. Mist began rolling in from the valleys, so dense it obscured trees 10 feet away. Sounds distorted. Birds chirped in irregular patterns. The wind hummed through branches like whispered voices. Shadows moved against the mist, indistinct, almost human, then gone when I focused. I felt that something followed me on every hike, just beyond vision, pacing my path with patience I could not fathom. And the radio, never wrong, continued its daily reports, growing more cryptic. The tower watches. They are near. Do not trust the path that moves. One evening, compelled by a force I did not understand, I decided to hike the forest at night to confront the phenomenon. My flashlight's beam trembled as it cut through the mist, illuminating fallen logs, jagged rocks, and trees scarred with fire. Then I saw it, a tall figure, hunched, dark, impossibly wide-shouldered, moving between trees with a grace that no human could achieve. I froze. My rational mind screamed to retreat, but something rooted me in place. Its eyes, or the impression of eyes, caught mine briefly. Then it vanished, leaving only the faint scent of smoke and the imprint of massive footprints. I recognized the pattern instantly, the same footprints in the ash that had haunted my hikes. When I returned to the tower, shaking and breathless, the radio spoke again. Not a report, not instructions, just one word, drawn out, almost reverent: remember. And I understood. This was not a game, not a hallucination born of fatigue. The forest had its own memory, its own guardians, its own ledger. I had trespassed unknowingly into something older, something patient. Sleep came fitfully, and when it did, my dreams were not my own. I wandered the burned tower, following footprints that twisted and elongated, always disappearing just ahead of me. Whispers spoke my name, sometimes gentle, sometimes furious. I woke in cold sweat, convinced I had been outside in the dark, though the bed was untouched. Fear had become my companion, my teacher, my mirror. And yet a strange, reluctant fascination held me, the desire to see, to understand, to witness the forest's truth without losing my grip entirely on the world I knew. I couldn't shake the feeling that each day the forest was learning me as much as I was learning it. The mist hung thicker over the ridges now, curling through the trees like the tendrils of something alive, watching. Even in daylight, I felt exposed, naked to the elements, to the eyes that weren't human. Each step on the softened earth felt amplified. Each snap of a twig sounded like a drumbeat announcing my presence. I began hiking with a new awareness, cataloging every scent, every sound, every movement. Nothing was trivial. A displaced pine cone, a bird flying low across a clearing, a sudden rush of cold air. Everything became a potential warning. The radio crackled again on my second week of patrol. I hesitated before pressing the button to respond. Instinctively, I feared any interaction might provoke what I could neither see nor fully comprehend. The voice was soft this time, almost coaxing. Do not fear the shadow. Follow the ash. It was as though the forest itself had learned the language of persuasion, or perhaps it had learned mine. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was staggering. Every fiber of my being told me to retreat, but my training and a darker, compounding curiosity compelled me to move forward. I hiked toward the burned ruins of Tower 11 again, taking the ridge route the radio had suggested. The ash underfoot was warmer than expected, as if it retained some residual heat from fires long gone. I traced the footprints carefully this time, feeling their rhythm, their deliberate pacing. They were massive, larger than any man, wider than any bear, and yet undeniably intentional, each step an imprint of awareness. My hands shook as I followed the trail to a hollow in the forest where the air turned thick and heavy, almost viscous. It smelled faintly of charred wood and something else. Something metallic. Blood or iron from the old lightning strike that had consumed the tower? I couldn't tell. And then I saw it. A shape, hunched but towering, stepping carefully between trees. It was not fully visible, but the silhouette alone made my stomach knot. Its arms were long, its gait deliberate, almost human, yet impossible. I froze, and for a heartbeat I thought it had seen me. Its head turned, slowly, deliberately, and I felt the weight of its gaze. Not a pair of eyes, but a presence, as if the forest itself were staring. My legs wanted to run, but my curiosity rooted me to the ground. The footprints in the ash made sense now. They belonged to this creature, this sentinel of the burned tower, this guardian of some memory too old to name. It did not move toward me. It did not flee. It simply observed, each motion calculated, each breath measured. I remember feeling a strange, involuntary respect for it, as though the forest had sent me a teacher rather than a threat. and then, just as silently as it had appeared, it vanished into the trees. The only evidence it had been there was the warmth of the ash underfoot and the faint echo of a grunt, low and guttural, vibrating through the ridge. I returned to my own tower that night with a mind spinning between fear and awe. I wrote everything down in my journal, careful to capture every sensory detail: the heat of the ash, the metallic scent, the shifting fog, the subtle vibrations through the earth when the creature moved. I could feel the forest pressing in, reminding me that observation alone was not enough. Respect and vigilance were mandatory. Sleep was impossible. Every sound became amplified: the scraping of branches, the whispering wind, the distant howl of something I refused to name. I lay awake, listening, imagining, fearing, trying to reconcile the creature with my understanding of the world. Days blurred into a rhythm of patrols and reports, but each excursion pushed me further. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings. I noticed patterns I had never seen before: a broken branch pointing in the direction of the ash trail, the way certain trees leaned toward each other as if in silent communication, the rhythm of distant streams changing subtly from day to day. Each discovery was a warning, a clue, or perhaps a taunt. My reflection in the tower window grew gaunt, eyes sunken with sleepless nights. I realized I no longer just walked in the forest, I was being guided. The next encounter came not from sight, but sound. One evening, as the sun dipped behind jagged peaks, a repetitive knocking began somewhere beyond the ridge. Slow, deliberate, resonant. My pulse jumped. I scanned the surrounding trees with my flashlight, its beam trembling in my hands. The knocking continued, steady and unyielding, punctuating the silence like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I followed the sound, each step cautious, calculated, every nerve screaming. It led me to a clearing I had passed countless times before, yet tonight it seemed alien, as though the forest had shifted subtly in my absence. And there, in the center of the clearing, was a single stump surrounded by fresh ash. The knocking stopped the moment I approached. In the half-light, I saw prints radiating from the stump in every direction, massive, deliberate, larger than any bear or man. They circled me, then stopped abruptly at the edge of the clearing. My breath came in shallow gasps. I wanted to flee, to run back to the safety of the tower, but I couldn't. Some deep, instinctual part of me recognized that this was not aggression. It was a message. I could not decipher it, but I understood the gravity. I had trespassed on something sacred, something that existed outside time, and yet it had allowed me to witness its presence. The nights became unbearable. Each radio report seemed to resonate directly with my consciousness. The hollow waits for understanding. Do not stray from the ash. They watch with patience. The forest was no longer just a backdrop. It was an active participant in my descent, shaping my thoughts, guiding my actions, reminding me of the fragility of reason when faced with the unknown. Shadows stretched unnaturally, fog swirled with intent, and I began to hear whispers carried on the wind, faint syllables that might have been words, might have been a trick of my mind. One particularly frigid night, compelled by a mix of dread and determination, I hiked to the site of Tower 11 under a full moon. The ash glowed faintly in its light as though reflecting some inner heat. Footprints radiated outward, larger and more precise than ever. And then I saw it. The creature, crouched near the remains of the tower, its massive head tilting as if observing me, assessing me. Its form was clearer than before: wide shoulders, elongated arms, powerful legs, the smell of char and damp surrounding it like a halo. And yet it did not move, it simply waited. I understood then that the creature, whatever it was not my enemy. It was the forest's sentinel, a living record of the tower's memory and of every tragedy, every fire, every disappearance that had scarred this land. I felt fear, yes, but mingled with a profound respect, an understanding that I was witnessing a living piece of history, a manifestation of the forest's resilience and patience. And in that moment, I realized the radio was not merely a tool, it was a bridge between the living forest and the human mind, translating warnings, instructions, and perhaps a form of empathy I could barely comprehend. By the time I returned to my own tower, dawn was breaking. Mist clung to the ridges, curling like smoke, hiding secrets I was only beginning to grasp. I had survived, but I was changed. I could no longer look at the forest and see only trees, paths, and wildlife. I saw intention, sentience, a ledger of life and loss that demanded recognition. My journal filled with meticulous records of every encounter, every footprint, every scent, every sound. My body ached from the hikes, my mind strained under the weight of awareness, but I was more alive than I had ever been, attuned to a world most people would never comprehend. The creature never approached closer than a few hundred feet, never attacked, never made direct contact beyond observation, and yet its presence was undeniable. A constant reminder that the forest has its own memory, its own rules, and its own guardians. I began to see signs in unexpected places. Trees scarred in patterns that mirrored the footprints, patches of ash where nothing should have burned, disturbances in the undergrowth that suggested movement without trace. I learned to interpret these signs as I would weather patterns or animal tracks. They were warnings, guidance, and lessons, cryptic, terrifying, and essential. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of dread and obsession. I stopped tracking the hours, the weather, even my meals. My life became the tower, the ash, and the footprints. Every morning I climbed the stairs, feeling the tower sway beneath me as if it remembered the storms it had weathered decades ago. Storms I had never witnessed but that left a residue in the wood, a faint echo of trauma embedded in every splinter. I began to understand the forest not as a passive observer, but as a patient adversary, watching my habits, cataloging my fears, and testing the limits of my endurance. One morning, the radio crackled with unusual urgency. "Garrett, they move at night. They remember your scent. Do not linger." The voice was fragmented, distorted, but unmistakable. I couldn't ignore it. I packed only what I could carry and set off for Tower 11 under the rising sun. The forest greeted me as always, fog hugging the ridges, branches tangling at my face, the faint scent of char and iron lingering in the wind. Every step I took felt scrutinized, measured against some invisible standard. I was being tested. The footprints led me to the hollow near the burned tower, but today the ash seemed fresher, warmer underfoot, as though it had been disturbed moments before I arrived. My pulse thumped against my ribs, every nerve screamed warning. I moved cautiously, scanning the trees for movement, listening for sounds, anything that might betray the presence of the creature. The forest was alive in a way I had never imagined. Leaves rustled without wind. Shadows stretched and recoiled in the fog, fleeting but deliberate. I understood then that I was no longer merely an observer. I was part of whatever memory the forest preserved, an actor in a drama older than any ranger I had trained under. And then I heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very soil. I froze, straining to locate the source. The growl was not near, yet it echoed from multiple directions, as though the forest itself were vocalizing its presence through the trees. My rational mind screamed for explanation. Bears, mountain lions, some trick of echoing wind. But instinct told me otherwise. This sound was deliberate. It was intelligence in its purest, most terrifying form. I caught movement from the corner of my eye, a shadow sliding between the trunks of pines. Taller than any human, broader than any bear, its gait unnervingly precise. My throat tightened. My hands, numb from the cold and adrenaline, gripped the journal in which I recorded every anomaly. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to obey. Curiosity, fear, and something else, a silent acknowledgement of the forest's power, kept me rooted. The creature emerged into a clearing briefly, its silhouette illuminated by a shaft of sunlight breaking through the mist. Its head tilted, observing me with intent I could not decipher. Time stretched unnaturally. I could feel the creature's gaze pressing into me, assessing me, weighing my resolve. And then it moved, slowly, deliberately, stepping into the hollow where the footprints had led. The ash shifted under its weight, heat radiating faintly even through the mist. My breath caught. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet my body remained frozen. The forest had taught me patience, observation, reverence. And in that moment, I understood that my survival depended not on fleeing, but on acknowledging presence, on respecting boundaries I had not yet fully understood. Night fell without warning, the forest folding into darkness as if swallowing the sun itself. I remained near the clearing, watching, listening, absorbing every nuance of the environment. Sounds amplified, the snap of a twig, the distant rush of a creek, the whisper of wind through needles, all became signs, warnings, lessons. I began to perceive patterns I had missed before. The rhythm of the creature's steps, the alignment of shadows, the subtle shifts in mist density. The forest was speaking. I was learning to listen. Sleep returned in fragments, each dream indistinguishable from reality. I wandered among charred trees, following footprints that elongated and multiplied, leading me deeper into hollows I had never seen. Voices whispered my name, not angrily, not pleadingly, but as though testing my reaction, measuring my courage. Each time I awoke, my clothes were damp with condensation, my journal pages smudged from shaking hands, and the faint scent of ash and iron clinging to my skin. Reality and dream had begun to blur. I began to wonder if I had ever truly left the forest, or if the tower and the hollow were permanent states of being, accessible only to those who listened. Then came the night that truly changed me. I was following a new set of footprints in the ash, larger and deeper than ever before, leading toward a ridge I had avoided for weeks. The radio crackled once. "Do not climb. They know your fear." I ignored it. Fear had become a tool, sharpened into something I could wield with awareness. My boots sank into ash that glowed faintly under the moonlight, each step a test of endurance and courage. Shadows lengthened, twisted, merged into forms I could not name. The creature was near. I felt its presence before I saw it, a weight pressing down through the mist, through the air, into my chest. It emerged suddenly from the fog. Taller than any man, head hunched, arms swinging with a deliberate strength. Its eyes, or what I perceived as eyes, locked onto mine. My heartbeat doubled, tripled, a violent drum in my ears. Instinct screamed to flee, but the forest had taught me patience, observation, reverence. I stood my ground, journal in hand, recording everything I could, desperate to preserve even the faintest impression of this encounter. The creature did not advance, it simply observed. Then, in a gesture that was almost imperceptible, it lifted one massive hand, pointing toward the burned tower. The ash glimmered faintly, disturbed in patterns that seemed almost intentional, like a map or a message I could not yet read. And then it vanished, slipping into the trees as silently as it had appeared. I remained for hours, frozen, absorbing every detail, every nuance, every lesson the forest offered. By the time I returned to my tower, dawn was breaking, the mist curling around the ridges like a living thing. I felt changed, irrevocably. Fear was no longer a reaction. It was a tool, a lens through which I perceived the world. The forest, the creature, the burned tower, they were no longer anomalies to explain or fears to dismiss. They were teachers, guides, and reminders of the fragility of reason in the face of a reality that exists beyond comprehension. In the weeks that followed, my patrols became rituals. I moved with care, awareness sharpened to a painful edge. Every footprint, every whisper, every glint of ash was cataloged, interpreted, respected. The radio messages continued, sometimes urgent, sometimes cryptic, always demanding attention. And always, in the moments of quiet, I felt the presence of the creature, patient, observing, teaching. I began to notice subtle changes in myself. My reflexes sharpened. My perception of space and time became fluid. I learned to interpret the forest's whispers not as hallucinations, but as vital information. And I began to understand the forest's ledger, not as a record of human activity alone, but as a living archive of everything that had occurred within its boundaries, preserved and guarded by sentinels I could neither name nor fully comprehend. One night, standing on the tower, looking over the ridges shrouded in mist, I realized something profound. Fear is not merely a survival mechanism. It is a teacher. It is a bridge between what we know and what we cannot comprehend. The creature, the burned tower, the footprints, they were all part of a lesson I was only beginning to understand. And for the first time, I felt that fragile, terrifying clarity. The forest does not exist to be conquered or mapped. It exists to be respected, to be observed, and to be understood in its own terms, on its own timeline. The nights had grown colder, the mist thicker, the shadows longer. Each step I took through the forest felt as though I were walking in a dream, or perhaps a memory that belonged to someone or something else. Sleep had become a tenuous state, visited only in fragments, and I no longer knew whether I was awake or wandering in the forest's mind. The footprints in the ash had multiplied, sometimes appearing where no path existed, sometimes leading me in circles, daring me to follow, and always, somewhere beyond vision, the creature watched, patient, immutable. One evening, compelled by a mixture of fear and determination I could not name, I decided to climb the highest ridge visible from my tower, the place where the forest met the sky, where the burned Tower 11 loomed like a scar on the landscape. The radio crackled once, with a message that seemed almost human in its urgency. "Do not ascend. The ledger is watching." I hesitated, heart hammering. The voice, distorted by decades in static, carried a weight I could feel in my bones. And yet, I knew I had to see this through. Some unspoken understanding told me that comprehension lay at the top of the ridge, that the forest demanded confrontation, not retreat. The ascent was brutal. The air thinned, carrying a sharp, metallic scent that made my lungs burn. Mist clung to the trees like cobwebs, and every shadow seemed to move just out of reach of my sight. I followed the footprints, careful, deliberate, absorbing every detail. The forest seemed to pulse with life beneath my boots, each step met with a subtle resistance, as though the earth itself were aware of my trespass. I remembered the first time I had seen the creature in the clearing, and I understood something then that I had only begun to grasp. Fear was not punishment, it was instruction. Every tremor in my body, every racing heartbeat, every shadow and whisper was part of the lesson. And then I saw it. The creature emerged from the mist, larger and more formidable than ever, moving with an elegance that defied its size. Its eyes, or the impressions of eyes, locked onto mine. I did not run. I could not. The forest had taught me that the only way to endure was to acknowledge presence, to meet awareness with awareness. The creature tilted its massive head, and I understood with sudden clarity that I was no longer a mere observer. I was a participant, a witness, a part of the forest's living memory. I followed it silently as it led me closer to the burned tower. The air vibrated with a low hum, the ash beneath my feet faintly warm. The footprints ended at the hollowed base of the tower, forming a circle around a charred stump. I knelt, placing my hand on the ash. It was warm, almost pulsing, alive in a way I could feel in my fingers. The creature crouched nearby, watching, and I felt no malice in its presence, only expectation. The forest, I realized, had been waiting for me to arrive at this point, to understand that survival was not about dominance or conquest, but about respect, observation, and reverence. The mist shifted, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I thought I saw shapes in the fog. Faces of those lost, of towers burned and rebuilt in memory, of hikers who had vanished without trace. The creature's presence became a bridge between past and present, between fear and comprehension. I understood that the radio messages, the ash, the footprints, the whispers, they were all part of a ledger, a record of the forest's long memory, each lesson meticulously preserved. And I, a rookie ranger who had once believed himself prepared for anything, was now humbled by the enormity of what I did not know. Hours passed. I do not know how long I remained there, kneeling in the ash, listening to the forest breathe and the creature observe. The radio crackled one final time. "Remember, Garrett, the ledger watches. Do not forget." And then silence. Absolute, profound silence. The creature vanished into the fog, leaving no trace beyond the faint heat of the ash and the echo of its presence in my mind. I rose slowly, understanding that the forest had not released me. It had educated me, shaped me, made me a part of its living memory. Returning to my tower, the world felt different. The forest was no longer a backdrop for human activity, no longer a collection of trees and wildlife and terrain to be conquered or patrolled. It was alive, sentient, patient. Every whisper of wind, every rustle of leaves, every shaft of sunlight filtering through the pines carried lessons, warnings, and stories older than any ranger station or patrol route. I had walked among shadows, faced the unknown, and emerged changed, not triumphant, but aware, humbled, and vigilant. I began to see the signs everywhere, the ash on trails that led to no clear destination, subtle disturbances in the undergrowth, shadows that moved independently of the sun. Each was a reminder that the forest was not mine to command. It was mine to witness, to respect, and to learn from. The radio remained silent after that night, as if the forest had completed its final instruction, trusting me to carry the lesson forward without further guidance. I documented everything meticulously: the footprints, the ash, the creature, the whispers. Every encounter became part of my journal, a ledger of understanding as sacred as the forest itself. I returned to the trails not as a novice ranger eager to patrol, but as a steward aware of the delicate balance between human curiosity and natural sovereignty. Fear had become a companion, a tool, a lens through which I interpreted the world, and I had learned that fear, when faced with courage and respect, could be transformative rather than paralyzing. Years have passed since that first patrol atop the tower. I have become a veteran ranger, my name whispered in the halls of Forest Service offices as one who understands not just the terrain, but its hidden rhythms. And yet, when the mist clings to the ridges, when the wind rustles through the pines in that peculiar, deliberate pattern, I feel the same presence I did on that first encounter, the weight of observation, the patient intelligence that watches, remembers, and teaches. I have shared my knowledge cautiously. Few believe in the creature, the ash, or the burned tower that still exists in memory more than in physicality. But I do not seek belief. I seek understanding. For myself, for those who will walk the trails after me, for anyone willing to see the forest not as a resource, but as a living entity alive with history, memory, and guardianship. The ledger endures, and so must respect. The forest watches, and so must we. And in the quiet moments when the forest exhales and the mist curls like smoke across the ridges, I remember the lesson most profoundly. Fear is not weakness. Fear is not defeat. Fear is a teacher, a bridge, a reminder that we are small, ephemeral, and fragile, but that we can endure, witness, and learn if we approach the unknown with reverence, patience, and courage. The forest does not forgive ignorance. It does not reward hubris, but it grants wisdom to those who walk among its shadows with humility. And sometimes, just sometimes, it allows you to glimpse its guardians, the tall, silent sentinels who stride between memory and reality, teaching us that the line between fear and understanding is thinner than we imagine. I remain here in the Shoshone National Forest, atop my tower, listening to the wind, to the rustling pines, to the distant echoes of a burned tower that still breathes in ash. And I am no longer the rookie ranger who arrived unprepared. I am a witness, a student, a keeper of the ledger. The forest watches, and so do I. I never thought the forest could lie to me. Not in all the years I've walked its trails, marked its trees, and guided lost hikers back to safety. Yet, that morning, as the cold wind clawed through the pines and the low mist crept over the Adirondack ridges, I realized that even the forest could betray you. My name is not important. Not really. Call me a ranger, a guardian of the woods, someone who has spent more nights sleeping under the skeletal branches than in a bed. I am in my 40s, have hair prematurely flecked with gray from stress, cold, and the faint terror of too many things that cannot be explained. People around the village know me. They nod and wave when I drive past the small general store, the ones who have hiked these trails 100 times and never left their maps. They trust me. I am meant to be reliable. And yet, as I glanced at the first trail marker of the day, I noticed something impossible. The arrow was pointing the wrong way. I dismissed it at first, an easy rationalization. The trail crew must have rotated it accidentally, or maybe the snow and ice had shifted the sign. I reached out and corrected it, pressing the sign back into its proper alignment. but a creeping unease had already wormed its way into my chest. The wind moaned through the branches as if it carried a warning. My boots crunched the frost-laden path, a rhythm I had memorized from countless patrols. Still, a part of me kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something just beyond the tree line. I began my morning rounds on the ridge trail, a steep climb with ancient birches and spruce so tightly packed the sunlight never seemed to touch the moss beneath. The trail markers here were my responsibility: painted arrows, carved notches, reflective squares for night patrols. It was simple work in theory: keep the hikers safe, keep the forest orderly. But that morning, I felt a subtle discord in the air. The smell of wet pine resin was heavier, cloying, almost like it was pressing against my nostrils. I chalked it up to the melting frost and moved on, but the sensation lingered, a gnawing awareness that something had shifted. As I climbed higher, I noticed the second anomaly. A small cairn, rocks stacked neatly at the trail's edge, was toppled. Not just slightly knocked, but violently disturbed, as if some unseen hand had tipped it over. I froze. My mind scrambled for explanations. Hikers, deer, wind. Yet the snow showed no tracks, no signs of another presence, and the wind had barely whispered through the pines. My pulse quickened, not with panic, but with the sharp, cold edge of awareness that I was being observed. I checked the map on my clipboard, eyes scanning the printed lines, the marked waypoints, trying to reassure myself that nothing was wrong. But as I lifted my gaze to the next trail marker, my stomach dropped. The arrow pointed not downhill as it had yesterday, but straight into the dense forest, a direction I knew led nowhere, or rather nowhere safe. I shook my head, muttering to myself, "Someone's playing a prank. Couldn't be anything else." But when I turned the corner, ready to follow the path that should have led back to the ranger station, I felt the world tilt. The trees were different, thicker, closer, impossibly aligned in ways they hadn't been the day before. A trail I knew by memory now twisted and forked where it shouldn't. My rational mind struggled to impose logic, but each step forward pressed me further into unease. By midday, I had made my way to a small clearing near the summit, a spot where hikers often stopped to rest. Usually the view stretched for miles, the valleys below cradled in green and gray, the mountains folding into themselves like the pages of an ancient book. But that day, the clearing felt wrong. The air was unnaturally still, the silence heavy and thick. Even the birds were absent. I could hear my own breath and the faint snap of ice underfoot. I reached out to steady myself on a boulder, and that's when I noticed the footprints. Large, uneven, impossibly wide for any human. They pressed into the snow and dirt, leading toward the ridge that I knew was impassable. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I crouched, examining them. Bear? Possibly. Moose? Maybe. But nothing moved like this. Nothing left prints like that without breaking branches, leaving traces of disturbed foliage. And yet the prints were precise, deliberate, a pattern of steps that suggested intelligence. I stood frozen, listening. A faint sound carried from the far edge of the clearing, an almost imperceptible rustle, like cloth brushing against trees, or perhaps the slow, heavy exhalation of something enormous. My rational mind searched for the source. Deer. Wind. Falling branches. Yet my instincts, honed from decades patrolling these forests, screamed that this was no ordinary animal. I spent hours circling the area, checking for anything familiar, anything human. Nothing. The prints vanished abruptly at the edge of a thicket, as if the creature had folded itself into the trees and disappeared. My chest tightened. I considered radioing the station, but I hesitated. What would I say? That the forest had changed overnight? That the trail signs themselves had betrayed me? That the trees had moved while I wasn't looking? My voice, when I finally forced it into the radio, sounded hollow. "All clear on the ridge trail," I reported. Even as the words left my lips, I knew they were false. Night came faster than I expected, the sky folding into a dense gray that swallowed the summit. I set up my temporary post near a cluster of birches, the fire pit I kept for emergencies crackling weakly against the cold. The forest seemed to lean in, shadows stretching long fingers toward me. I told myself it was just the dim light playing tricks on my eyes. Yet, every crack of a branch, every whisper of wind sounded deliberate, as if the trees themselves were speaking in a language I had no capacity to understand. I tried to sleep, curling into my jacket, ears straining. Around midnight, the sound came, the first unmistakable sign of intrusion, footsteps crunching snow outside the perimeter of my small fire. Not deer, not raccoon, heavy, measured, deliberate. I froze, heart hammering against ribs, listening. The footsteps stopped, silence. Then a low, guttural exhalation. A breath so close I could feel it in the hairs on my neck. I reached for my flashlight, every nerve taut. The beam swung across the clearing, empty. Only shadows, only the trees, only me, clutching the light, trying to convince myself I was safe. I never slept that night. I stayed awake, eyes darting, ears straining for the slightest disturbance. Each time the wind picked up, it felt like a sigh of warning, a reminder that the forest was alive in ways I had never imagined. At dawn, I packed my gear, intent on leaving the summit, retracing my steps to the station. But the trail, it had changed again. Arrows reversed, cairns rearranged. The ridge path I had taken yesterday now led in circles, folding back toward the same clearing. I could feel a cold rage rising, but more than that, fear, pure, unrelenting fear. I radioed for a colleague, a fellow ranger stationed at the northern edge of the park. "Something's wrong here," I admitted, voice tight. "The trail markers, they're moving, the trees, I don't know, something's out here." There was a pause on the other end, a silence that made my stomach sink. "We'll check it out," my colleague replied. But the uncertainty in his voice was clear. I was left alone, retracing steps I no longer recognized, following a map that seemed to contradict itself, watching the shadows of trees twist and sway as if alive. The forest was pressing in, thick and suffocating, and I began to understand that I was not the protector here. Not today. Today, I was the prey. I moved cautiously, my boots sinking slightly into the snow that had fallen overnight. The sun was barely above the horizon, a dull smear of light through the mist, and yet it offered no comfort. Every shadow seemed to twist in the corner of my vision. Every tree bent just enough to suggest a presence watching me. The forest had grown alien overnight, or perhaps it had always been this way, and only now had I begun to see it. I tried to rationalize it. Exhaustion, stress, the isolation of patrols. But rationality was slipping, like fine sand through my fingers. I followed the path as best I could, consulting my map over and over, but the trail refused to stay fixed. Cairns toppled, arrows reversed, trees that had stood at the edge of the trail yesterday now obstructed my path. The forest seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting subtly, guiding me, misdirecting me. I stopped near a cluster of spruce and felt the pressure of being observed, something ancient and patient watching, waiting. My hands shook as I touched the bark, rough and cold, trying to ground myself. A sound broke the silence, a snapping branch, far but deliberate. My heart leapt into my throat. I spun, flashlight beam stabbing into the shadows, but saw nothing. Just snow-dusted ground, the faint tracks I had left earlier, and nothing else. I whispered a name, my own, almost hoping for an answer. Silence. Then came a deeper sound. Heavy exhalations, almost human in rhythm, but impossibly large. I froze, realizing I was no longer alone, and that whatever had followed me last night, or perhaps had been here before, was still here, patient, measuring. I took a step forward, another exhalation, closer this time. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my training told me to stay calm, assess, survive. I moved slowly, scanning the trees, listening. And then I saw it, or thought I did. A shadow between the trunks, massive, hunched, and moving with a grace that no human could achieve. Its eyes, or something that reflected light like eyes, glimmered for a brief second before disappearing behind the trees. I swallowed hard, every rational thought scrambling to reconcile the impossible. The path curved into a narrow gorge, a place I knew well. But today it felt different. The air was colder here, heavier, smelling of damp earth and something else, something metallic like blood and iron. I tried to focus on the trail, but my gaze kept drifting to the shadows between the rocks, to the way the snow had been scuffed and scraped in patterns I did not recognize. And then I heard it, a low, guttural rumble vibrating through the ground itself. My knees buckled, but I forced myself upright. I had walked these woods in every season through ice storms and blizzards, but I had never heard anything like this. I considered turning back. Rationality screamed at me to retreat, to radio for assistance, but a compulsion, irrational and overwhelming, pulled me forward. Something about the way the forest had shifted, the way the trail refused to obey, made me feel that I had no choice. I was drawn into the gorge, deeper and deeper, the walls of rock pressing in. My flashlight flickered, the beam catching something at the edge of my vision. A figure? A boulder? I wasn't sure. Every step I took seemed to echo unnaturally, the sound bouncing off the gorge walls like a mocking rhythm. Then came the first direct encounter. I stumbled over a root and fell hard, snow spraying over my gloves and jacket. As I scrambled to my feet, I saw it, larger than any bear I had ever seen, standing upright in the shadow of the gorge. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the weak morning light, and I could feel its intelligence, its awareness of me. I wanted to shout, to call out, but the sound caught in my throat. The creature tilted its head, studying me, and for a moment I felt a perverse curiosity emanating from it, as though it understood me better than I understood myself. I ran. My boots tore through the snow, heart hammering, lungs burning. The trail behind me seemed to stretch, bend, twist in impossible ways. I passed cairns I had set up myself, only to find them rearranged, stacked in patterns that felt like warnings. The trees themselves seemed to lean toward me, branches snagging at my jacket, scratching my face, tugging at my sanity. I tried to keep moving, to keep the path straight, but the forest had become a labyrinth. Every familiar marker was gone, replaced by an alien geometry that mocked my every step. The snow deepened and my boots left heavy prints, yet I had the eerie sensation that something enormous, was following me, stepping where I could not see. Sometimes, when I dared a glance behind, I thought I saw glimpses of a figure, hunched, massive, slipping between the trees. Other times there was only snow, disturbed in patterns I could not explain, as if the forest itself was alive and had imprinted its own path. Hours passed. Perhaps it was only minutes. Time had lost meaning. Exhausted, I stumbled into a small hollow, sinking to my knees, gasping. My mind raced, replaying every patrol I had ever done, every encounter I had survived. And yet nothing prepared me for this. The forest had turned against me, and something else had awakened within it. I pressed my hands to the ground, feeling vibrations through the snow. The rumble returned, low and resonant, as though something immense had taken interest in me. I tried to recall every survival technique I had been taught, every emergency protocol, but the forest mocked each rational thought. My radio, left on the snow beside me, crackled intermittently, catching faint sounds, footsteps, shuffling, something moving just beyond comprehension. I leaned closer to the device, straining to make sense of it. There were voices too, almost human, layered with something else, groans, growls, whispers that seemed to speak directly into my mind. Then, silence. Total silence, except for the rhythmic pounding of my heart. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. When I opened them again, the hollow was empty. The path I had stumbled upon was gone, replaced by dense trees that should not have been there, and in their midst a faint glimmer of movement, retreating into the shadow of the higher cliffs. I had no idea where I was, no idea which way led back to the ranger station, back to safety, back to reason. Desperation took hold. I tried to climb higher to gain a vantage point, but the incline was treacherous, covered in ice and snow. Each step risked a fall, yet the pull of something unseen pushed me onward. I stumbled, slid, and finally collapsed against a rock ledge, chest heaving. And then I saw it again, closer this time. The figure was massive, towering, moving with a grace that seemed impossible for its size. Its face, or what I assumed was a face, was obscured by shadow, yet its presence was undeniable. I felt the weight of its gaze, and for a terrifying moment I understood fear in its purest form. Not fear of death, but fear of the unknown, fear of the forest itself, fear of reality bending against me. I screamed. Perhaps it was a warning or a plea. The sound seemed to echo endlessly, swallowed by the gorge, returned as a distorted echo that chilled me to the bone. The figure moved closer, yet never attacked. It watched, patient, a predator of thought rather than flesh. I realized then that I was not meant to escape. The forest was a living entity, and I was merely a guest it no longer welcomed. Exhausted and broken, I crawled toward what I hoped was the trail, tracing the vague impressions in the snow, but the forest shifted beneath me, folding over itself. Branches caught my coat, snow collapsed underfoot, and the hollowing wind seemed to whisper, mocking my confusion. And yet I kept moving, propelled by a mixture of terror and determination, knowing that giving up would mean losing myself completely. I do not know how long I wandered. Hours? Days? The sun vanished behind thick clouds, leaving the world in a dim gray that blurred distance and shadow. I could feel eyes on me constantly, could sense movement just beyond the edge of my vision. Every time I stopped, a presence approached. Every time I ran, the forest twisted to impede me. And always the figure, sometimes glimpsed, sometimes only felt, followed, measuring, waiting, patient beyond comprehension. At one point, I stumbled across my own footprints from the previous day. They led into a small grove, but instead of the path continuing, the grove seemed endless, a tunnel of trees that swallowed all light. My heart sank. I realized then that my patrol had ended not in the clearing, not at the station, but somewhere else entirely, a place beyond my memory, beyond reason. The forest had rewritten itself, and I had no choice but to follow, to confront whatever had been orchestrating this nightmare. And then, faintly, I heard it. The crunch of snow behind me, not my own, not human, but deliberate. Something following. Something immense. My breath caught. My pulse thundered. I rose to my feet, weaponless, unarmed, facing the unknown. I understood in that instant that this was no ordinary animal, no trick of the mind. This was something else, something ancient, and it had chosen to reveal itself to me. I ran again, stumbling through the snow, the trees looming like silent sentinels. My lungs burned, my muscles screamed, and yet I could not stop. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the forest itself were resisting me, pressing against my body with invisible hands. I tried to retrace my path to find anything familiar, but the terrain had betrayed me. Snowdrifts I had walked past yesterday now blocked my way. Trails I had memorized twisted in impossible ways, and the grove I thought I had escaped now seemed to stretch endlessly, folding in on itself like a maze. The forest whispered. Not wind, not animals, but a soft, persistent murmuring that threaded through the trees. Words I could not understand, phrases that pressed against my skull, teasing the edges of recognition. Sometimes the whispers rose in pitch like laughter. Sometimes they fell silent, leaving only the oppressive weight of snow and shadow. I tried to ignore them, focusing on the crunch of my boots, the rhythm of my pulse. But the whispers followed, circling, mocking, insinuating doubt into every thought. I questioned my senses, my memory, my very sanity. I stopped briefly at a clearing, chest heaving, eyes scanning the forest around me. The clearing had been a safe place once, a spot where I had taught hikers to rest, to admire the view, to breathe. Now it was alien. Snow-covered boulders jutted from the ground like broken teeth. The trees leaned inward unnaturally, trunks twisted, branches forming archways that seemed to beckon me deeper. And in the far corner, I saw it again, the massive shadow. Larger than any bear, more human than any animal, yet distinctly neither. It watched from the edge, its form half concealed, yet undeniably present. I dared to take a step forward, heart thundering. The shadow moved with the fluidity of water, sliding between the trees without sound, and then stopped. Its eyes, or whatever glowed in the dim light, fixed on me. I felt an intelligence there, a consciousness that was ancient, patient, and cruel. I realized with a cold certainty that this was no mere animal, no prankster hiker, no figment of exhaustion. Something had been here long before me, and it had learned patience. It had learned me. Panic began to claw at me. The rational part of my mind tried to assert control, tried to calculate a path, a strategy, an escape, but the forest refused to yield to logic. Cairns I had built were now toppled into strange formations. Symbols, perhaps, a language I did not know. Trail markers that should have guided me were reversed, erased, or pointing toward the thickets where the shadows moved. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of wet earth, decaying wood, and something else. Something metallic that made my stomach twist. I stumbled into a narrow gully, snow up to my knees, rocks slick and dangerous beneath the thin layer of ice. The shadow followed, never fast, never close, but always there, an oppressive presence pressing on my mind. I felt the rhythm of its steps echoing in my chest, a heartbeat that was not mine. I called out, voice cracking, "Show yourself! What do you want?" My words were swallowed by the forest, twisted into whispers that returned to me with mockery. Hours, or perhaps minutes, passed. Time had no meaning here. The sun was gone, replaced by a gray sky that seemed to bend down toward the trees, pressing them closer, folding the world into itself. My legs ached, my body was cold, and yet I could not stop. The shadow was patient but persistent. Every time I thought I had lost it, the forest reminded me that it was always there. A branch would snap, snow would shift, a gust of wind would carry a breath that smelled like iron and fur. Then I heard it, a low, guttural sound, almost a growl, almost a word, emanating from the trees ahead. My heart froze. The shadow moved closer, stepping into a shaft of gray light, revealing its massive form. It was taller than any human, covered in dark hair matted with snow, limbs long and powerful. Its face was hidden, but I could feel its gaze, an intelligence that weighed on me like a physical force. I realized with a sinking clarity that this was not just an encounter. It was a confrontation, one I had no chance of winning. I ran blindly, crashing through underbrush, slipping in snow, branches tearing at my jacket and face. The forest seemed to mock me, folding and twisting, the trail vanishing beneath my feet. I heard laughter then, deep and resonant, vibrating through the trees, echoing in my skull. It was not human. It was older, colder, a sound that seemed to come from the forest itself. I wanted to stop, to face it, but terror propelled me forward. Each step felt heavier, the snow refusing to give way, the trees pressing closer, narrowing the world to a corridor of white and shadow. Exhaustion overtook me. I fell against a tree, snow melting into my gloves. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I realized that the forest had me. Not in a physical sense, but in a mental one. My memory faltered. Paths I had walked yesterday no longer existed. The ridge, the summit, the clearing, all replaced by twisted imitations, corridors of ice and shadow. And through it all, the shadow followed, patient, silent, always just out of reach, waiting for me to falter. I remembered the stories, the old tales whispered among rangers when the forest grew dark and the wind carried voices not meant for human ears. The missing hikers, the footprints too large to be human, the sounds of something moving through the trees at night. I had dismissed them, considered them myths, folklore to scare new rangers into caution. But now I understood. The forest had its guardians, creatures older than any man could comprehend, and I had wandered into their domain. I tried to call for help, fingers fumbling with the radio, snow clinging to the buttons. Static answered, and then a faint sound, distant, echoing. Footsteps. Not mine. Not human. My pulse jumped. The shadow was closer, stepping silently in the snow, circling, observing. I whispered a prayer I hadn't believed in for years, and I moved again, propelled by fear, desperation, and the faint glimmer of hope that somehow I could survive this. I stumbled into a clearing that seemed impossibly familiar, yet alien. The snow was undisturbed, smooth as if untouched by the chaos I had endured. Cairns stood in perfect stacks. Trail markers pointed where they should. And then I realized the clearing was not mine. Not yesterday's clearing. The shape of the trees, the bend of the ridge, the distant cliffs. It was all wrong, yet I recognized something. The shadow had been here too. Its footprints in the snow, massive and deliberate, leading away, vanished as if swallowed by the earth. I sank to my knees, hands clutching my head, trying to reconcile the impossible. I was alive, yet I had changed. The forest had changed me. Rational thought, confidence, certainty, they had all been stripped away. In their place was a raw, primal fear, tempered with a profound awareness of forces beyond human understanding. I realized that this forest, these mountains, had secrets buried deep in the folds of their ridges, and some secrets were meant to remain undisturbed. Hours later, I stumbled back onto a trail I recognized, a familiar path that led toward the ranger station. My boots left prints, human and trembling, but the snow whispered beneath them, as if the forest itself were watching, judging. I reached the station as night fell, the cold seeping into my bones. My radio crackled again, this time with the voices of colleagues checking on my progress. I wanted to tell them everything, every detail, every impossible moment, but the words caught in my throat. How could I explain that the forest had moved, that something ancient had watched me, had toyed with me? I reported only the facts. Trails checked, no signs of hikers, no incidents. Yet, as I drove my truck through the darkened forest, headlights cutting through the mist, I felt it again. The gaze of the shadow, waiting, somewhere just beyond the edges of perception. I knew then that this encounter was not the end, not by far. The forest had marked me, had claimed a piece of my mind, and some night, some winter, it would call again. I reached my cabin, locked the door, and tried to sleep. But the silence was deceptive. In the dead of night, I heard footsteps in the snow outside, slow, deliberate, echoing the rhythm of that first encounter. I pressed my ear to the radio, static dancing across the frequencies, and for a brief moment thought I heard my own voice, distorted, calling from somewhere beyond the trees. I slept fitfully, haunted by the shadow, the whispers, the forest that could not be mapped or contained. Morning came not with relief, but with a heavy, suffocating quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had reorganized itself overnight, shifting while I slept. Even from inside my cabin, I could hear the subtle movements, the soft groan of massive branches, snow falling silently from invisible heights, and the faint whisper of footsteps circling the clearing outside. I told myself it was imagination, the lingering terror of yesterday's events, yet every instinct in my body screamed otherwise. I packed my gear, refusing to stay any longer. I had to leave the area to reach the main road, to see the sky open and the mountains settle into familiar shapes. But as I stepped outside, the world itself seemed altered. Snow lay thick in unnatural drifts, masking paths I knew by heart. Trees loomed closer, their silhouettes jagged, as if the forest were leaning in to watch me, to judge me. My boots sank into the snow, leaving deep prints, yet behind me the faintest impression of something else followed. Wider, heavier, perfectly parallel to mine, though I had no memory of anyone else being there. I moved cautiously, following a path that I thought should lead to the ridge trail, but each step felt heavier, as if the forest resisted me. Cairns I had built as guides now appeared toppled or rearranged, arrows pointing not towards safety, but into thickets where light did not penetrate. And then I heard it again. Footsteps. Deliberate, crunching the snow with a weight that no human could bear. They weren't close, not yet, but they were moving in tandem, like a heartbeat out of sync, waiting for me to falter. Fear clawed at my chest, but I forced myself forward. Rational thought was useless here. I abandoned my usual protocols, abandoning careful scanning, abandoning caution, and simply moved. The trees seemed to bend around me, shadows stretching unnaturally, gaps in the forest appearing where none had existed. I caught glimpses of movement, not a figure exactly, but a shifting of mass, of shape in the periphery of my vision. Each time I turned, there was nothing. Yet I could feel it, the presence, a pressure that pressed against my mind, sapping certainty, breeding doubt. Hours passed in a blur. Snowfall thickened, fog rolled in from the northern slopes, reducing visibility to a mere few feet. I could hear my own breath, harsh and ragged, mingling with faint exhalations that were not my own. The shadow, or creature, remained unseen, yet its presence was undeniable. I stumbled upon a frozen brook, the ice brittle beneath my boots. I paused, considering the risk, when I realized something horrifying. My footprints from the previous day were not alone. Beside them, prints far larger, deeper, impossible to mistake, mirrored mine exactly, leading onward into the forest. Panic overtook me. I spun around, scanning for any sign of movement, but the forest remained still, deceptive, oppressive. My heart pounded, muscles trembling. I called out, not for help, but as a challenge, a plea, a warning. I see you. Show yourself. The words seemed swallowed instantly, twisted by the fog into a distant echo, returning faintly like laughter. And then the first unmistakable sound, a guttural, low rumble that rolled across the snow like thunder, yet contained an intelligence, a rhythm, a purpose. I ran. My boots tore through the snow, limbs screaming, lungs burning. The forest twisted around me, that familiar landmarks no longer existed. Cairns were rearranged in patterns that made no sense, arrows reversed, trails folded into themselves. The shadow was never far, always just outside the beam of my flashlight, moving with terrifying grace, testing me. At one point, I tripped, sliding down a narrow slope, snow spraying over my jacket. I glanced up briefly, and in that instant, I saw it. Larger than any human, standing upright, a mass of dark hair glistening with frost, eyes glowing faintly, fixed on me. It did not charge, did not roar, did not move aggressively, yet its presence crushed my resolve. It was patient. It had been watching, waiting, learning, and now it understood me. I realized, with a cold clarity, that I had not just wandered into its domain. I had become prey, subject to rules older than any I had ever known. Desperation guided me then. I abandoned the trails entirely, climbing over rocks, slipping across ice, pushing through thickets that tore at my clothes and scratched my skin. The shadow moved with me, circling, staying just out of reach, testing, probing. Every time I stumbled, it drew nearer. Every time I paused, it observed. And always, there was the forest itself. Trees leaning, snow shifting, wind carrying faint whispers I could almost understand. Eventually, I reached a ridge that overlooked a deep hollow. The view should have been comforting, familiar, but the world was unrecognizable. The snow-covered valleys stretched like a distorted reflection of themselves, the mountains folding into impossible angles. And there, at the edge of the ridge, I saw another sign of impossibility. My own truck, parked where it had been, engine idling, radio crackling faintly with static. I ran toward it, hope sparking, thinking rescue, thinking civilization. But the closer I got, the more my mind faltered. The forest had changed again. Trees had shifted, shadows moved like liquid, and the snow beneath my feet seemed almost to rise, to resist me. I reached the truck, hands shaking, and the moment I touched the door, I realized the horror fully. The radio was not silent. Faintly, I could hear footsteps crunching through snow, close, deliberate, circling the truck. My own voice echoed from the static at intervals, distorted, pleading. And then the snow shifted behind me. I turned slowly. The shadow was there, immense, hunched, patient, and somehow judging. I climbed into the truck, hands gripping the wheel, sweat freezing on my skin. I tried to start the engine, but it was already running. The radio continued to transmit the sound of the unseen, footsteps circling in the snow outside, as though the forest itself were speaking, announcing that I had trespassed too far. I understood then. There would be no escape. The forest and the creature within it would not allow me to leave with reason intact. Not yet, perhaps never. The hours blurred. I do not know how long I sat there, engine idling, radio crackling, heart hammering, watching the snow shift and the trees lean. Daylight failed entirely. The forest grew oppressive, almost tactile, and the shadow never left. I pressed my hands to my face, tried to breathe, tried to convince myself it was fatigue, imagination, a hallucination born of stress. But the prints outside were real. The footprints of something impossibly large, steps echoing mine perfectly, leading nowhere. By nightfall, exhaustion claimed me. I drifted in and out of consciousness, each time hearing the same crunch of snow, the same rumble of breath, the same whispering that pressed against my mind. I understood, finally, that this forest had claimed me in a way I could not quantify. It had not killed me, yet, but it had altered the fabric of my reality. Somewhere in those snow-laden ridges, in those shifting groves, the forest watched, infinite and patient. I was merely a part of its memory now, a story it would retell in the echoes of wind and ice. When rescue teams found the truck days later, it was idling as I had left it. The radio crackled faintly with static, interrupted occasionally by the sound of footsteps crunching snow. The forest around the ridge had reverted, or so it seemed, to normal. Trails were straight, cairns upright, trees in familiar positions. There was no sign of me. Only the truck remained, an empty shell in the white wilderness. And yet, those who ventured into that part of the Adirondacks speak of shadows moving between the trees, footprints that appear and vanish, and whispers on the wind that seem to call your name. I will never return to that forest, yet in dreams it comes for me still. The Ridge Trail is etched into my mind, not as a place of work or beauty, but as a reminder. Reason is fragile, human certainty is fleeting, and the forest holds secrets older than any man can understand. Those who wander without respect, without awareness, may find themselves marked, not with scars or injuries, but with the knowledge that some places are alive, patient, and merciless. I tell this story not to scare, but to warn, to remind anyone who would venture into the deep Adirondacks that the forest watches, and sometimes it rearranges itself while you are not looking. Trail markers may change overnight, cairns may topple, and the snow may bear witness to presences beyond comprehension. My experience is not unique. Others have disappeared. Others have heard the whispers. Others have returned, changed, hollowed, silent. The forest teaches patience, humility, and fear. It reminds us that even the most confident, seasoned ranger is powerless before what is unknown, before what is patient, before what has always been here, waiting. And though I walk other trails now, far from the Ridge Trail, I feel its presence in the wind, in the snow, in the quiet places where shadows linger. It is not vengeance, not malice, simply the eternal, patient rhythm of a wilderness older than our maps, our paths, our lives. And so if you ever find yourself standing at a trailhead in the Adirondacks, take a moment. Listen. Watch the trees. Check your trail markers twice, and then a third time. Move carefully, humbly, and remember, the forest is alive in ways we cannot see, and sometimes when the snow is deep and the wind is still, it walks beside you, unseen, patient, eternal. I never thought the forest could speak until the night I heard it whisper my name. I had been walking the ridges of Appalachia for nearly a decade, and in that time, I had seen my share of shadows, strange tracks in the mud, and the distant gleam of eyes that weren't human. But there's a different kind of fear when the earth itself seems to breathe beneath your feet, when the wind carries a language you almost, but not quite, understand. My name is unimportant here. What matters is that I am a forest ranger in West Virginia, tasked with guarding lands where history has buried more than it has revealed. I've always believed that the mountains are patient, that time smooths over the scars of man. But some scars fester, some remain. It started after the fire, the kind of wildfire that doesn't just scorch the underbrush, but drags the forest into a skeletal silence. Trees that had stood for centuries fell like dominoes, leaving the air thick with the scent of smoke and something else, something almost metallic. When the call came in, it was a mine shaft exposed by the blaze. Old, forgotten, dangerous. They wanted me to seal it off. Easy enough, I thought. I've sealed off abandoned mines before. It was routine. But when I arrived at the site, the earth felt wrong. Not the natural weight of the mountains, not the settling of soil after fire, but a pressure, subtle and persistent, like the air itself was watching, waiting. The mouth of the mine yawned like a silent scream. Charred wood littered the entrance, and a thin haze of smoke still curled from deep inside. I knelt, shining my flashlight into the blackness. The walls were scarred, not just with the fire's burn marks, but with carvings. I squinted, leaning closer, heart thumping. At first, I thought it was some hiker's graffiti. Initials, dates, maybe a crude message. But as I traced the lines with my gloved hand, a chill ran down my spine. The words were deliberate, precise, and unmistakable. We're still here. My stomach twisted. The first thought that crossed my mind was that it was some prank, a local teenager playing with the legends of the mine. But the markings were old, older than any graffiti I had seen. The cuts in the stone were deep, worn by time, yet recent in a way that no human hand could replicate so neatly without purpose. I stood up, trying to shake the feeling that something in the forest had just noticed me, that it had been waiting. The birds were silent, the wind had stilled, and even the faint rustle of leaves seemed absent. The mountain had fallen into a holding pattern, a tense silence like the pause before a predator strikes. I made my way to the edge of the clearing, setting up the temporary barricades they had supplied, chains, boards, warning signs. But every nail I hammered, every plank I raised, felt almost ceremonial, as though I were marking a boundary that someone or something was already testing. My radio crackled once, the signal weak, but enough to remind me I wasn't alone. I had a partner scheduled to relieve me the next morning, but the night shift was mine. Alone, I told myself it was just an old mine, just a precaution, just a forest in Appalachia. But the phrase carved into stone gnawed at me. We're still here. As twilight bled into night, I set up my camp just beyond the tree line, a little fire to keep the chill at bay, the smell of smoke from my lantern mixing with the scorched earth. That's when I noticed it, a sound from deep within the mine. At first, it was a rhythmic tapping, almost imperceptible. I froze, listening. My training as a ranger kicked in, scanning for wildlife, for falling rocks, for anything that might explain it, but the sound wasn't random. It was too deliberate, too measured. Tap, tap, tap. The first hour passed. My mind tried to rationalize. Perhaps a loose timber, water dripping in the shaft, a branch caught on something. But the tapping continued, low, resonant, echoing as if the mountain itself had lungs. And then, just as I was convincing myself it was nothing, the tapping shifted. It came from deeper, as if something or someone was moving just beyond the reach of my light. My pulse quickened. Every instinct I had screamed to retreat, but curiosity rooted me in place. The carvings flashed in my memory. We're still here. Not a threat, but a declaration. A warning. I grabbed my flashlight and approached the mine. The smell hit me first. A pungent, metallic stench, sour with decay. My boots crunched on charred debris. I swept the beam across the interior walls, tracing the carvings that had suddenly become more than words. They were symbols, patterns almost alive, twisting in the shadows. And then I saw it. A movement. A flicker. Just at the edge of the light. My breath caught. I froze. Whatever it was, it didn't run, didn't hide completely. It waited as if studying me, calculating. The tapping grew louder, faster, urgent, and then it stopped. Silence returned, thick and suffocating. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run back to the comfort of my cabin, to tell myself that I had imagined everything. But I stayed, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. A whisper came then, soft, almost human. You shouldn't be here. My spine stiffened. The voice wasn't carried by the wind. It was embedded in the walls, in the air itself. I realized then that the mine was not just a hollow beneath the mountain. It was a memory, a vessel, a place that refused to let go of what had been buried. Hours passed like this. Shadows moved in ways they shouldn't. The tapping returned, now accompanied by a low, guttural sound, like something exhaling from deep underground. I kept my flashlight trained on the tunnel, watching the darkness pulse as though alive. And then, faintly, I heard breathing. Slow, deliberate, inhuman. My heart hammered. I knew enough about the forest to recognize that whatever was making these sounds wasn't a bear or any creature cataloged in any ranger manual. This was something older, something that had watched these woods long before I ever walked them. I slept in fits, huddled by the fire, each time waking to the sound of the tapping resuming beneath the earth. At some point, I began leaving offerings, scraps of food, small trinkets, thinking maybe appeasement would keep whatever lived below at bay. But that only made the scratches appear higher near the barricades on the wooden planks I had driven into the soil. I would wake in the middle of the night to find new carvings etched into the surface of the wood, simple words, yet chilling in their insistence. Closer. The next day, I met with the local historian, a wiry man who had spent his life tracking the old mines. He told me stories half joking, half serious, about miners disappearing, about strange creatures glimpsed in the shadows, about the old legends of Appalachia. They spoke of beings that lived between the rocks and the roots, that waited for the fire to clear the forest, to make the weak of heart reveal themselves. "It's just stories," he said. But I could see the tremor in his hands when he pointed toward the mine. He knew. Everyone knew. The mountain remembers, and it watches. That night I returned, armed with more than chains and boards. I brought steel spikes, torches, a radio left on to maintain contact with the ranger station. I thought that preparation would give me control, but fear has a way of twisting control into illusion. As I approached the mine, I realized the carvings had changed overnight. No longer words, no longer letters. Symbols writhed along the walls as if they were breathing, moving when I wasn't looking directly at them. The tapping started again, faster, more insistent, like a heartbeat amplified by the earth. I screamed into the darkness, "I'm sealing this! I'm closing it!" And for a moment I thought it would stop. It did not. Instead, something moved in the shadows, taller than any man, hulking, with limbs that bent in ways nature never intended. It didn't step into the light. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough to warp the air, to turn the wind into a howl, to make the forest lean in as if it too were terrified. My hands shook on the steel spikes. My voice caught. I knew, in that instant, that sealing the mine was no longer about safety. It was about survival. The tapping turned into pounding. The earth throbbed. The mountain spoke in a language I could not decipher. And then the voice returned, close, whispering in a tone that sounded almost like my own fear. "You cannot leave until you remember." The words made no sense, yet I understood them. The mine was a ledger. The carvings, the shadows, the fire, it was all a memory of those who had vanished, who had been swallowed by greed, by curiosity, by recklessness. And now it had marked me. I barely slept that night, watching the mine through a haze of smoke and sweat. When dawn broke, I returned to the barricade with a resolve I didn't feel. I hammered, I chained, I cursed. And yet, even as I left, I knew it was futile. Whatever had crawled out of the mine, whatever had been waiting, it would not be contained by wood or steel. It lived in the earth, in the echoes, in the fear that clung to the marrow of my bones. That was the night I learned that the forest doesn't merely contain danger. It cultivates it, nurtures it, waits until you are alone enough, tired enough, human enough, to finally understand its lessons. And the mine had lessons to teach, but they were not my own. They belonged to the mountain, to the darkness beneath the ground, to whatever had been there long before we claimed the land as ours. I left that site changed, not broken, but altered. Each step I take into the forest now carries a memory of that night. The smell of burnt wood, the metallic tang in the air, the whispering walls, the tapping beneath my feet. And though I continue my patrols, I know that the mine is watching, always watching. I cannot tell you what lies within. I only know that some boundaries are not meant to be crossed, some doors not meant to be opened, and yet the memory lingers. We are not alone in these woods. The mountain remembers. And sometimes, when the wind is right, I hear the tapping again, counting out a warning, or perhaps an invitation. I do not go back. But the fear, the knowledge, follows me, as constant and inescapable as the Appalachian ridges themselves. The days after the fire and the mine incident were long, but the nights were worse. The forest doesn't sleep, not truly. Even when the wind is still and the smoke has cleared, the trees creak in ways that sound like bones shifting, like the earth itself sighing. I tried to tell myself that I had imagined it, the carvings, the tapping, the voice, but every instinct I had screamed otherwise. I started seeing movement in the shadows where there should have been nothing. A flicker of gray between two burned pines, a dark shape vanishing when I blinked. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end constantly, and the feeling that I was being watched never left. I told myself that I needed to return to the mine, not because I wanted to, but because the barricade wouldn't last. The chains would rust, the planks would rot, and I couldn't risk anyone else wandering into that darkness. So, one evening, I packed my gear, rope, flashlights, a thermos of coffee, my radio, and returned to the clearing. The air was colder than usual, damp and sour with the scent of burnt soil and moss. I felt like I was walking through a memory, not just a forest. Every step I took toward the mine felt like descending into something alive, something patient. The carvings on the barricade had changed. New words, deeper scratches, as though something or someone had been there since I left. They were barely legible, but I could make out fragments. Closer still, do not forget. My stomach churned. I didn't know whether to be terrified or angry, and the uncertainty gnawed at me. I slammed my flashlight onto the entrance and shone it down the tunnel. Shadows danced along the walls, shifting like liquid, and for a brief moment I thought I saw a figure crouched deep within. The tapping started almost immediately. Tap, tap, tap. Not random, it was deliberate, a rhythm. Sometimes fast, sometimes slow, like a heartbeat. I told myself I would go in just a short distance to inspect the carvings inside. But as I descended into the mine, the temperature dropped sharply and the smell became suffocating. Rot, earth, iron, and something else, something almost sweet but wrong. My gloves felt clammy, my breath visible in the beam of my flashlight. The walls seemed to close in, and the sound of my own heartbeat echoed unnaturally, as though amplified by the earth itself. I stumbled upon more carvings. This time they weren't just words, they were shapes, symbols, faces, crude yet precise, etched into the stone with a care that was disturbing. And beneath them I saw footprints. Not human, too large, too long, the toes angled wrong, the heel dragging slightly. They led deeper into the darkness. My rational mind tried to argue it away. Animals, old miners, debris, but my gut screamed that these prints were recent, and worse, that whatever had made them had been waiting for me. I pressed on, and that's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl echoing from deep within the mine. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hands. The sound was unlike anything I had heard in the forest, a combination of something alive and something ancient, as if the stone itself was voicing rage. I called out, voice hoarse, trying to assert control. "I'm here! I'm sealing this place! Show yourself!" The echo that returned was not a voice, not entirely, but it mimicked my own words in a distorted, slow cadence. I staggered back, stomach knotting. I knew I should have left, run back to safety, but I couldn't. There was a compulsion, something magnetic in the mine, pulling me forward. I kept moving, deeper, each step dragging me into a labyrinth of shadows and fear. The tapping became a pounding, like someone or something was hammering from below. Then the whisper came again, closer this time, threading itself around my consciousness. "You cannot leave. You do not remember." My breath caught. I realized with a rising panic that I had not been coming here by choice. I had been drawn. The forest had decided I needed to learn. I tripped over a loose rock and fell, scraping my hands along the stone. When I raised my flashlight, I saw a shape that made my stomach seize. A figure crouched at the far end of the tunnel, taller than a man, covered in matted hair, eyes reflecting the beam like molten gold. It didn't move toward me, but I felt its gaze, an intense, intelligent awareness, weighing me, understanding me in ways no human could. My rational mind tried to grasp for explanations, a bear, a Bigfoot, a hallucination from exhaustion, but the figure didn't smell like an animal. Its presence was deliberate, cerebral, like it knew I was intruding. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, only to find the path behind me changed. The walls seemed narrower, the tunnel twisting unnaturally, as if the mine itself had reshaped to contain me. Panic surged. I screamed, voice echoing, but the sound was swallowed. The mine was a living thing now, and I was the prey. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded directly beneath me. I dropped to my hands and knees, pressing my ear against the stone. The rhythm was like a heartbeat, but not mine. It was deeper, older, echoing from some place beneath the mountain where sunlight had never reached. I remembered the words etched into the barricade, "Do not forget," and suddenly images flooded my mind. Faces of miners, pale and gaunt, carved into the shadows. Memories that weren't mine but felt like they should be. Stories of greed, of curiosity that led men to dig too deep to awaken something they could not understand. The mine was a ledger, a repository of fear, and I was being inducted into its history whether I wanted to or not. The figure moved, or perhaps the shadows did. but I felt its proximity before I saw it. I could smell it then, the stench of damp fur and earth, and the heat of something inhuman. The mine throbbed with life, pulsing under my feet. I scrambled backward, tripping again, and my flashlight fell, spinning its beam across the walls. The carvings glowed in the beam, not with light, but with the revelation of meaning. Symbols for survival, warnings, threats. We are still here. We do not forgive. We remember. And then I heard the voice again, clear, human now, but impossibly deep. Do you remember? It was not a question. It was a summons. My mind reeled. What was I supposed to remember? Faces flashed before me, friends, strangers, events from years ago I hadn't thought of in decades, all connected somehow to this forest, this mountain, this mine. My knees buckled. I pressed myself against the wall, shaking, praying for clarity, praying for escape. I ran. Not carefully, not measured. I ran through the twisting tunnels, leaping over rubble, nearly falling into fissures that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Tap, tap, tap. The sound followed me relentlessly, now joined by a low growl, a wet rasp like claws dragging across stone. I could feel its presence behind me, taller than I, patient and inevitable. I dared not turn. Every instinct in my body screamed that if I looked, I would see the truth. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The mine opened into a larger chamber, and the air changed. Warmth returned. The forest above seemed distant, irrelevant. I collapsed on the ground, chest heaving, trying to force my mind to make sense of what had just occurred. I was alone, or so I thought. But the carvings remained, symbols that now seemed alive, writhing faintly in the dim light. The words were unmistakable. You are part of us now. My pulse slowed, but the dread lingered. I realized I had survived not because I was strong, not because I was clever, but because the forest and whatever dwelled in its depths had chosen to let me live. For now. I crawled back to the barricade at first light, exhausted and broken. I reinforced it with chains, concrete, whatever I could find, knowing it would not stop what waited beneath the earth. And as I walked away, I could hear the forest exhaling, the wind sighing through the burned trees, carrying a whisper just audible over the rustle of leaves. We're still here. Even now, weeks later, I can hear it in my dreams. Tap, tap, tap. A rhythm like a heartbeat, like a warning, like a memory demanding attention. The forest hasn't forgotten, and I haven't either. The mine waits, patient and eternal. And I know that one day, whether I return willingly or not, I will walk back into that darkness, drawn by a compulsion I cannot resist because the mountain remembers. And so I patrol, always listening, always watching, a sentinel in a forest that is older, wiser, and infinitely more patient than I could ever be. The mine taught me that fear is not a fleeting thing. It is a presence, tangible and alive, rooted in the earth, in memory, in shadows that crawl when no one is watching. And sometimes late at night, when the wind carries the faint scent of smoke and metal, I swear I hear it, the tapping, the whispering, and the promise that some doors, once opened, are never truly closed. I told myself I was stronger than the fear, that experience and training would carry me through. But the forest does not respect strength. It only responds to presence, to awareness, to the quiet pulse of life that trembles when it senses something watching. Days passed and I patrolled as usual, logging the burnt areas, checking for hazards, repairing trails. Yet the memory of the mine lingered like a shadow glued to my shoulder. Every sound became important. A snapped twig sounded like a footstep. A distant owl hoot morphed into laughter. Even my own voice startled me when I spoke aloud. I could not shake the feeling that something followed me, something patient, always just out of sight. One afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the ridges, painting the burnt forest in shades of red and orange, I received a report from a hiker. They had wandered near the old mine, curious about its sudden exposure, and now were trapped, or so they said, by fear. I offered to escort them, though my hands were shaking. As we approached the mine, I noticed the markings had multiplied. Now, the carvings were not just words, but full scenes etched into stone and wood. Miners staring into darkness, faces twisted in terror, hands clawing at walls. My stomach churned. These weren't warnings. They were records. Records of those who had come before and never left. I tried to explain to the hiker that the mine was dangerous, that the forest was recovering from fire, that everything was routine, but they weren't listening. Their fear mirrored mine in ways that made it contagious. And that's when the tapping started again. Soft at first, then deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. My chest tightened. My flashlight flickered. I realized then that the mine did not just exist below ground. It extended into the forest itself, reaching out, bending the world around it until it could touch you wherever you walked. The hiker froze, eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" they whispered. I nodded, voice tight. The tapping came again, closer this time, echoing through the trees, vibrating the ground under our boots. Something moved in the shadows, tall, thin, unnervingly human in shape, yet wrong. Limbs bent at impossible angles, hair matted and dark, eyes reflecting the dim light like molten gold. It did not move toward us. It didn't need to. Presence alone was enough to shift the air, to make the world contract, to make your body feel too heavy to move. I felt it then. The compulsion. The forest was guiding us, urging us forward, coaxing us toward the mine. The hiker glanced at me, panic rising in their expression. I should have turned, led them away, but I could not. The same force that had drawn me once now gripped me again. I followed the path, heart hammering, mind screaming, into the black maw that yawned beneath the earth. The air grew colder as we descended, damp and metallic, thick with the stench of decay. Every step echoed unnaturally, the walls seeming to absorb sound and then spit it back with a distortion that made the tunnel feel alive. The tapping intensified, tap, 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 and beneath it a low growl, a resonance that vibrated through bone and marrow. I tried to recall rational explanations, water dripping, loose rocks, a bear, but the growl carried intelligence, awareness, malice. And then I heard it, the whisper. Not at first, but slowly, threading into the echoes around us. "You should not be here. You cannot leave." The hiker screamed, stumbling backward. I grabbed them, pulling them close. "Stay quiet," I hissed. But even as I spoke, I realized that silence would not save us. The mine had no mercy. We moved forward deeper into the labyrinth, shadows twisting in impossible ways, walls narrowing and expanding as though breathing. I could feel something following us, a pressure behind every step, the heat of something enormous, patient and hungry. And then we saw it. The figure crouched in a chamber, taller than a man, limbs like warped timber, eyes glowing with a golden intelligence. It did not approach. It did not flee. It simply watched. My flashlight trembled in my hands, flickering over the contours of its body. The hiker whimpered, gripping my arm, and I realized that fear itself had become tangible, a force we could feel pressing down, twisting our stomachs, tightening our chests. The tapping became a pounding, a rhythm like a heartbeat amplified by the mind. And then the whisper returned, human yet impossible. "Do you remember?" My knees buckled. The world around me shifted. I was no longer in the mine. I was somewhere else, somewhere ancient. Faces flickered at the edges of my vision, miners, travelers, children, hunters, all staring into darkness, all swallowed by the mountain. Memories not my own flooded my mind. I saw greed, curiosity, desperation, the need to know what should remain unknown. And then I understood the mind does not just consume, it records, it teaches, it chooses. I fell to the floor, hands over my ears, trying to block the flood of visions. The figure moved, or perhaps it didn't. The shadows shifted in tandem with my thoughts, twisting and bending. Tap, tap, tap. Closer. I dared not breathe. I dared not blink. The mind pulsed like a living organism, breathing through stone and root, whispering secrets older than the forest itself. The hikers screamed again, and I grabbed them, forcing us forward. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed in every chamber, in every corner, reverberating through our bones. I realized then that the mind was testing us, measuring our fear, our resolve, our understanding. And in that moment, a horrifying clarity struck. We were never meant to leave unchanged. I pressed forward, dragging the hiker behind me. The carvings on the walls seemed to writhe now, forming faces that contorted in silent screams. Symbols glowed faintly in the dark, telling stories without words. We moved as if underwater, slow and deliberate, every step a negotiation with gravity, with time, with the forest itself. Tap, tap, tap. Beneath us, around us, inside us. And then we reached the chamber at the heart of the mine. It was enormous, impossibly so, with walls that arched into darkness beyond the reach of our lights. Shadows pooled like liquid. The figure stood at the far end, fully erect now, massive, impossibly tall, its head tilted as if studying us, and I understood without words that this was no predator in the conventional sense. This was a sentinel, a keeper, a witness to the sins and mistakes of centuries. "You remember," it whispered, not in language, not with sound, but in thought, in a pressing weight that filled my mind. And I did. Memories I had buried, choices I had made, moments of doubt and hesitation, all lined up like a ledger in the mind's consciousness. I saw faces I had failed, lives I had ignored, warnings I had dismissed. And then the truth sank in. The mind does not forgive. It does not forget. It merely waits for you to understand. The hiker screamed again, breaking the trance. I grabbed them, dragging us backward, stumbling toward the tunnel we had entered. Tap, 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 tap. The sound followed us, relentless, the mine itself shaking with the rhythm as though mocking our flight. I thought we might escape, thought the daylight beyond the mouth of the mine would save us. But as we reached the entrance, I realized it was not the mine we feared. It was what the mine had made us confront. We emerged into the clearing at last, shaken, bloodied, exhausted. The forest had returned to normal, sunlight streaming through the charred pines, birds cautiously calling, wind rustling in the leaves, and yet the memory of the mine remained. The tapping echoed faintly in my mind, the whispers threaded through my thoughts. The figure had not followed us, or at least not in body, but it had marked us. In that moment, I understood that some encounters do not end. They linger, shaping the way you see the world, bending your perception, carving new fears into the soft tissue of your mind. I escorted the hiker back to the ranger station, logging every detail, every trembling pause, every distorted memory. My colleagues nodded politely, dismissing some of it as exhaustion, stress, imagination, but I knew the truth. The forest knows, the mind knows, and I had been chosen to remember, not just the fire, the carvings, or the figure in the dark, but the lessons encoded in fear, patience, and observation. That night, alone in my cabin, I heard the tapping again. Tap, tap, tap. Not outside, not beneath my feet, inside my skull. And then a whisper, "We remember you." I shivered, knowing that the mine, the mountain, the forest itself had embedded its lesson into my very being. And though I write this now, years later, I understand that I am still part of its ledger. My fear, my survival, my understanding, they all belong to it. I patrol the forest still, listening, watching, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath my boots. The mine waits, patient and eternal. And I know that one day, whether in flesh or memory, I will return. The tapping, the whispers, the shadows, they are never truly gone, and I will never forget. The nights after that encounter were the hardest. I slept little, never alone. Every creak of the cabin, every sigh of the wind through the trees sounded like the mine calling me back. The tapping, the low, insistent rhythm was in my ears even when the forest was silent. I began to see shadows in the corner of my vision, fleeting shapes with glinting eyes that vanished when I turned. It became impossible to trust my own senses. My colleagues noticed my unease, but offered no real counsel, no advice that could pierce the veil of what I now knew. Some things are not meant to be shared. I tried to avoid the mine, to ignore the compulsion that tugged at my consciousness, but the pull was inexorable. Every patrol, every hike, every moment spent in the burned forest seemed to edge me closer, as though the mountain itself conspired to guide me back. And then, one evening, I felt it, the same magnetic pressure, the same awareness, but stronger. It was a summons, impossible to resist. I packed my gear, taking only essentials: flashlight, radio, rope, and a notebook. I knew, somehow, that this would be the last time I would leave the mine willingly. The forest was silent as I approached, an unnatural stillness settling over the charred trees. Even the wind seemed to wait. The barricade I had reinforced weeks ago was in ruins, planks broken, chains twisted. The carvings were fresh, deep, etched into the wood and the surrounding soil. Come, remember, understand. My pulse hammered as I stepped closer, every nerve on fire. The mind's entrance yawned like an open mouth, black and infinite. And then I heard it, the tapping. Tap, 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 louder than ever, direct, personal. I descended into the shaft, flashlight trembling in my hands. The air was colder than any winter I had ever experienced, damp and metallic, reeking of decay, rot, and something sweetly wrong. The walls pulsed with a faint rhythm, as though alive. Tap, tap. It was the heartbeat of the mountain itself, echoing through stone, earth, and root, vibrating the marrow of my bones. Deeper, the carvings became scenes, full of motion, miners clawing at walls, figures bending in pain, shadows consuming men who had dared to probe too far. Faces flashed at me, some familiar, some strangers, but all filled with the same wide-eyed terror. My legs trembled. I realized that the mind did not just record history, it ingested it, preserved it, and now demanded that I participate. The figure appeared again, this time fully in view, fully erect, massive beyond comprehension. Its limbs were elongated, bent in unnatural angles, covered in matted hair, eyes glowing molten gold. It did not move, did not approach. Presence alone was enough. I could feel the weight of centuries in its gaze, the memory of all it had observed, all it had absorbed. Tap, tap, tap. It was synchronized with my own pulse, and I realized I was being measured, tested, cataloged. You remember, it whispered, not in sound but in thought, flooding my mind with the gravity of the forest and the mine. And I did. Memories I had buried, mistakes, regrets, missed warnings, human error. Moments I had dismissed now displayed before me in stark clarity. I understood then that the mind's terror was not arbitrary. It was moral. The mountain punished the negligent, the foolish, the careless. It demanded recognition, understanding, and respect. The tapping intensified, becoming a roar that seemed to come from every direction. Shadows writhed not just along the walls, but within the air itself, pooling and stretching, forming shapes that twisted impossibly. The figure raised a limb, or perhaps the shadows themselves rose, and the tunnel's walls shifted as though the mine were breathing. Panic surged. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, but the compulsion was stronger, holding me in place, forcing confrontation. I spoke aloud, voice cracking, shaking. I understand. I see it now. My words were swallowed by the shadows, absorbed into the stone, yet I felt them resonate, reaching whatever consciousness dwelled within. Tap, tap, tap. The figure did not retreat. It did not strike. It waited, patient, inexorable. And then the whisper. Then remember what must not be forgotten. Images assaulted my mind. Miners lost to greed, travelers consumed by curiosity, warnings ignored, boundaries crossed. I could feel the terror, the desperation, the cold hand of inevitability, yet through it all, a lesson emerged. The mine, the forest, the mountain, they did not punish to harm. They punished to teach. Survival required more than strength or courage. It required awareness, humility, the recognition that some doors, once opened, are never meant to be entered lightly. I fell to my knees, sweat soaking my clothes, hands pressed to the cold stone. The tapping slowed, synchronized with my ragged breathing. The figure lowered its head, eyes glowing steadily, not malicious, but watchful. The walls pulsed faintly, then dimmed, the shadows settling back into stillness. Tap, tap, tap. Fainter now, receding into the depths. And then silence. I stood unsteady, chest heaving. I realized I had been allowed to leave, not because I was strong, but because I had acknowledged, I had remembered, I had understood. The forest, the mine, the sentinel, whatever it was patient, infinitely patient, and it had tested me as it had tested all who came before. Those who did not survive were not merely victims. They were lessons, absorbed into the mountain, becoming part of its history, part of the pulse that now beat faintly in my own chest. When I emerged into the clearing, dawn was breaking. Sunlight slanted through the burnt trees, casting long shadows, illuminating the scorched earth. The carvings on the barricade glowed faintly in the early light, a final reminder, we are still here. We remember. I stood for a long moment, taking in the forest, listening to the wind, the distant calls of birds, the rustle of leaves. Life persisted, stubborn and resilient, yet beneath it all lay the memory of darkness, patient and eternal. I returned to my cabin, exhausted but enlightened. The tapping never completely left, but it had changed. Now it was a reminder, a rhythm in my bones, a quiet echo of the mountain's enduring presence. I patrol the forest as I always have, but differently, with awareness, with respect, with humility. I have learned to read the signs, to heed the whispers, to recognize that the forest is older, wiser, and infinitely more patient than any human. Sometimes, late at night, I walk near the old mine, standing at its mouth, staring into the black. I feel its weight, its gaze, its presence pressing against me, and I whisper back, acknowledging what I have learned. Tap, tap, tap. Faint, patient, eternal. And I know that some boundaries are not merely physical. They are moral, spiritual, eternal. The mine has marked me, and I will never forget. The forest is alive. The mountain remembers. And in the quiet moments when the wind is still and the shadows lengthen, I feel the tapping beneath the soil, the whisper in the trees, and I know that the mine waits. Not just for me, but for anyone who enters unaware, unprepared, unwilling to see. And I understand now. Fear is not just a response. It is a teacher, a sentinel, a guardian of truths buried deep beneath the earth. I have survived the mine, but survival is not the end. It is a beginning. Every patrol, every step in the forest, every listening ear is a continuation of the lesson. The tapping remains, faint but present, a heartbeat shared between me and the mountain. I know that one day when the wind shifts and the forest sighs, I will hear it louder, closer, as if calling me back. And I will go, not as a victim, but as a witness, carrying the memory, the fear, the understanding that the mine, the forest, and the sentinel are eternal, patient, and always watching. I am a ranger. I am a guardian. But above all, I am a student of the forest, a witness to the depths beneath the earth and a recipient of its enduring memory. And sometimes when night falls and the fire-scorched air carries the faint scent of smoke and iron, I close my eyes and listen, knowing that whatever waits in the mine is not gone. It is patient. It is eternal. I never believed in the things people whispered about the forest at night. At least not until I became part of it. My name isn't important. The people I work with, the campers I meet, they all know me by my uniform, my truck, the steady voice I carry over a crackling radio. But here at Crater Lake, Oregon, those identifiers feel hollow, fragile, like labels pinned to smoke. I came to the park when I was 28, fresh out of training, full of confidence, with a rigid sense of order. The forest doesn't respect that. The lake doesn't respect that. And I would learn, slowly and painfully, that neither do the lights. The first time I heard about the lights, a group of campers described them as shimmering blue orbs dancing over the surface of the water. They said it was mesmerizing, almost hypnotic, like the reflection of some distant star, but moving, slipping along the tree line, sometimes darting toward the middle of the lake, then vanishing. I told them it was probably drones or reflections or someone playing with a flashlight. And they laughed, some nervously, some in disbelief. I should have paid more attention to the tremor in their voices, the way their eyes avoided meeting mine when they spoke. That tremor was fear, subtle and unspoken, but it was real. For weeks, nothing happened. Routine patrols, rangers wandering along the trails, the lake calm and unassuming. I convinced myself that the lights were a myth, a product of imagination and fatigue. That's how I operate. I like to believe there's a rational explanation for everything. It keeps me sane, it keeps the visitors safe, it keeps me in control. Until that night. I remember it clearly. The wind had shifted, carrying a chill that cut through even my thick jacket. The forest smelled of wet pine needles and something older, something mossy, almost metallic that clung to the back of my throat. I was alone, rowing a small ranger boat out into the middle of Crater Lake, the radio crackling faintly behind me, voices of distant colleagues now muffled by the sudden isolation. The moonlight reflected off the water, a soft silver, and for a moment I felt the same serenity that draws people here. The raw beauty, the overwhelming quiet. Then I saw it. Blue. Not a reflection, not a flashlight, not a trick of the mind. A pulsing liquid blue hovering above the surface, moving with an intelligence I could feel more than see. It wasn't steady. It shifted, and when it approached, it seemed to bend the air around it, like the lake itself was responding to it. My heart started to pound, a deep mechanical drum that drowned out the gentle slap of the oars. I fumbled for the radio, trying to speak, trying to call someone. "There's something under me," I said, my voice trembling despite my training, my certainty. The radio crackled. Silence. Then static. I reached for the emergency channel. Nothing. Panic rose, slow and steady, crawling over my nerves like an ice-cold hand. The blue light pulsed once, then again, then vanished beneath the water. The lake went still, deceptively calm, but my instincts screamed that it was no longer safe. I tried to row back, tried to make sense of what had just happened, but every stroke felt sluggish, as if the water itself was thicker, resisting me. Morning found me nowhere. My boat washed ashore, the inside coated in frost that shouldn't have been possible at that hour. No sign of struggle, no footprints, nothing to indicate where I had gone or what had pulled me from the water. My colleagues found the frost first. They called it strange, then dismissed it. But I remember the cold, the way it burned against my skin even as it formed crystalline patterns across the oar handles. Something had been there. Something had touched me. And I knew, in that immediate, visceral way that can't be rationalized, that the lake was not empty. After that night, everything changed. I started noticing sounds, subtle at first, a knock on the ranger station door when no one was there, a rustle in the underbrush that paused whenever I looked directly at it. Campers reported shadows where none should exist, figures glimpsed just beyond the tree line. I tried to remain professional, to chalk it up to imagination, to overworked eyes and sleepless nights. But the forest has a way of eroding certainty. It whispers, it waits, and it teaches you lessons in the only way it knows how. I remember one night, a week after the frost incident, standing at the edge of a cliff overlooking the lake. The air was impossibly still, the surface black and reflective like oil. A soft, low hum resonated from somewhere deep beneath, vibrating through my boots, through my chest. My skin prickled. I felt it in my bones. The forest behind me seemed to lean closer, as though it were listening, weighing my hesitation. And then the lights returned, not one, but dozens of small blue flames flickering across the water's surface, moving in patterns that felt deliberate, intelligent. I wanted to run. I wanted to radio for backup. But my feet were frozen, my hands trembling on the railing, and I realized something terrifying. This wasn't just light. This was presence, awareness. I was being watched. I've always relied on rules, maps, patrol schedules, predictable patterns to navigate fear. That night, all of that meant nothing. I learned quickly, painfully, that fear isn't just about what you see. It's about what you don't see, what you cannot control, what you can only feel pressing against the back of your mind like water seeping under a door. That night, I understood the fragility of reason in a way no textbook could teach me. In the following weeks, I tried to assert control again. I returned to the lake, each night attempting to approach the lights, to see them for what they were, to find rational explanations. Sometimes I rowed for hours, only to return empty-handed. Sometimes, when I sat at the edge of the water, I swore I felt the lake itself stir beneath me, currents twisting in ways that defied logic. My radio would buzz sporadically, picking up faint voices that seemed to echo from beneath the water, distorted and mournful. I began to doubt my own senses, my own memory. Yet the fear was undeniable, a constant companion that shadowed every step I took through the forest. I learned slowly to observe differently, to notice the subtle cues the lake and forest provided, an unnatural frost forming overnight, branches snapping without wind, a faint whisper that didn't carry any words. Each signal carried its own dread, a warning I couldn't ignore. I began keeping meticulous notes, photographs, and recordings, anything to anchor myself in reality. And yet, each night, the lights returned, more daring, more intrusive, as if testing me. reminding me that my understanding was incomplete. The psychological toll was immense. Sleep became impossible. The line between waking and dreaming blurred. I would wake in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced that the blue lights had entered my room, that the frost had returned, coating the edges of the windows and the floors. I began hearing faint voices through the radio when it was turned off, whispers that promised answers but delivered only unease. My colleagues noticed my behavior, my distracted eyes, my unsteady hands. I told them it was fatigue, that I was adjusting to the altitude, the long nights. But even I knew that explanation was insufficient. It was during one of these nights, sitting alone by the water, that I understood the core truth of Crater Lake. It doesn't just reflect the sky. It reflects fear, desire, regret, every buried secret that humans carry, and it does not discriminate. The forest will not protect you. The water will not forgive. The lights, whatever they are, see everything. They know everything. And yet I kept going. Each patrol, each night alone, each encounter with the inexplicable, I persisted, not out of bravery, but out of necessity. Fear, I realized, is a teacher, relentless and unforgiving. It strips away pretense, exposes vulnerability, and forces you to confront truths you might otherwise ignore. I can still hear the lake at night, the faint pulse of the blue lights beneath the surface, the subtle vibrations in the water that hint at a presence just beyond comprehension. I know I am no longer the confident ranger who first arrived at Crater Lake, full of maps and schedules, rules and certainty. I am something else now. An observer, a witness, a participant in a reality that cannot be fully understood, only endured. And if I am lucky, perhaps I will survive long enough to make sense of it, to translate the lessons of fear into wisdom for those who come after me. Because that is what it means to be a ranger here. Not to conquer the forest, not to tame it, but to witness it, to carry its secrets, its terrors, and its beauty, and to emerge on the other side, if not unscathed, then at least aware. The nights became a rhythm I could not escape, a cadence dictated by the lake and its impossible lights. Every evening I found myself drawn toward the water, as if some unseen tether pulled me from the safety of the ranger station. I tried to resist, but the lake had a gravity all its own, not physical, not visible, but felt in the marrow of my bones. One night I remember gripping the oars so tightly that my knuckles went white, the small ranger boat rocking gently against the calm surface, and realizing that I was no longer rowing toward anything I could see. I was rowing toward something I could feel, and that was far more terrifying. The air was heavier that night, charged with electricity I could not explain. Mist curled across the water, thin and ghostly, curling around the bow of the boat like smoke from a candle that refused to die. My breath fogged in the cold air, the sound unnaturally loud against the vast silence. Then it started, a low, vibrating hum emanating from beneath the surface. At first I thought it was the motor, but there was no motor. Only the quiet pulse of the lake, a rhythm that synchronized with my heartbeat until I could no longer tell where my fear ended and the lake began. Then I saw it. A shadow, enormous and shifting, just below the surface. Its shape was indistinct, but I knew instinctively it was alive, aware, and far larger than anything I had ever seen in these waters. I froze, my oars suspended mid-stroke. The water rippled unnaturally, concentric waves radiating outward, brushing against the boat's hull like deliberate caresses. And then the lights appeared again, faint at first, flickering like distant lanterns beneath the mist. 1, 2, 3, dozens, pulsing, drifting in perfect coordination. They weren't reflections, weren't natural phenomena. They were intelligence incarnate, moving beneath and above the water in tandem, aware of me. I tried to speak into the radio, to call for help, but the words caught in my throat. My throat constricted as though the mist itself had entered my lungs. And then it came. The unmistakable sound of something moving beneath the water, the subtle creak of ribs, the ripple of massive limbs. My rational mind screamed that it could not exist, that no living thing should be able to generate such mass in these waters. My instincts screamed louder. Row, run, escape. I lifted my oars, but they felt heavier than iron. Every movement was sluggish, resisted by a force I could not see. I glanced down, and for the briefest moment, the shadow breached the surface, or at least came close. A ripple, a flash of something white, wet, and colossal. The surface of the lake seemed to collapse inward, drawing my stomach into my chest, and then just as quickly it vanished, leaving only the pale mist curling around the boat like nothing had happened. That was when I realized something deeper than fear, something more corrosive. I was no longer a protector, no longer a ranger. I was prey. And the forest, the lake, the lights, they were not waiting for me to learn. They were waiting for me to break. I tried again the following nights, each attempt bringing a new layer of horror. I began noticing the subtle ways the forest communicated its presence, the sudden silence of birds, the unnatural stillness of the trees, the way the fog seemed to anticipate my movements. One night I caught sight of footprints along the shore, enormous, humanoid, but not human. The prints disappeared into the water as if the lake itself had swallowed them. I followed them once, driven by curiosity or madness, I could not tell which, and came to a small inlet where the water was impossibly cold, the mist curling like smoke over black, mirror-like water. My hands trembled as I reached out to touch it, and the instant my fingers brushed the surface, I felt it. A force beneath the water, brushing against my fingers, testing, probing, alive. I flinched back, nearly toppling the boat, and the lights erupted in response, blazing, swirling, forming patterns that defied explanation. I wanted to understand, to rationalize, but every instinct screamed to leave. And yet something deeper kept me there, anchored to the lake as though by chains forged from fear itself. Sleep became impossible. I would nod off in the ranger station, only to wake with the hum in my ears, the lights blazing behind my eyelids. I began seeing shapes at the edge of my vision, glimpses of something humanoid, massive, impossibly fast, always retreating when I tried to focus. Campers began reporting voices in the woods at night, strange mist-like shapes hovering above the trails, and a chilling frost that formed even on warm nights. They laughed nervously at the idea, but I saw it, felt it, documented it, and knew it was real. One evening, I was patrolling a trail near the northern edge of the lake when I saw a figure. A man, I thought at first, standing among the trees. He was tall, impossibly tall, and his movements were too fluid, too deliberate. I called out, my voice steady, training kicking in. No response. The figure began to move toward me, but not like a person walking. It glided, silent, limbs bending in ways that made my stomach turn. I froze, every rational thought abandoned. And then I realized it was following me. Not because I was dangerous, not because I was a threat, but because I was there, alone, in the wrong place at the wrong time. I ran. My boots skidded against the wet earth, leaves slapping my legs, branches catching at my jacket. Behind me, I could hear it. Soft, impossible footsteps, moving in perfect rhythm with mine, echoing in the fog. I dared to glance back, and the shape was closer than I thought possible. Its eyes, if they were eyes, glinting faintly, blue, the same as the lights over the lake. I stumbled, fell, hit my head against a root. When I came to, the shape was gone. Only the fog remained, curling and curling like smoke, and the soft whispering of the lake, calling me back. After that night, I understood what the lake demanded: respect, attention, and absolute honesty with oneself. Deny fear, deny instinct, and it will punish you. Question reality, and it will answer with something worse. My confidence, my certainty, my years of training, they were irrelevant here. Only awareness mattered. Only survival mattered. I began documenting every encounter, every nuance, the frost forming overnight, the blue lights patterns, the sensation of something brushing against my boat, the whispers that seemed to echo from beneath the water. But with every note I wrote, every photograph I took, I felt my sanity eroding, slipping through my fingers like the mist that never truly left the lake's surface. I began dreaming of it, the lights, the shapes, the shadows moving through the trees. Dreams that felt like memory, memory that felt like prophecy. One night during a patrol of the southern shoreline, I saw the lights again. Hundreds of them, this time forming shapes, symbols I could not recognize, hovering over the lake like an ethereal army. I tried to row toward them, my hands shaking, and as I did, I felt it. The same massive force beneath the water, brushing against the boat, playful, testing, immense. I called into the radio, my voice breaking, but no one answered. And then as I approached the center of the lake, the lights coalesced into a single blinding pulse. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them, the lake was calm, the fog receding, as if nothing had ever happened, except for the frost lining the boat, the oars, my clothes, my skin, cold that burned like fire, that whispered that I had been marked. I realized then that the lights were not just phenomena. They were guardians, observers, or predators, perhaps all three. And the lake was not just water, it was memory, it was witness, it was something older than reason, older than human fear. And I, a simple ranger, trained to protect and rationalize, had no power here, only endurance, observation, and respect. And so I continue, each night drawn to the lake, each day walking the forest trails, recording, documenting, surviving. My confidence is gone, my certainty has been shattered. I am no longer a protector of the forest in the way I once imagined. I am its witness, its messenger, its terrified participant. And in this, perhaps there is some twisted form of purpose. I have learned the lesson Crater Lake demands. Fear is not weakness. Fear is information. Fear is life. But it is also a constant companion, a shadow that grows with every misstep, every glance at the wrong place at the wrong time. And the lights will never leave. They do not blink. They do not tire. They wait. And so do I, rowing into the mist, listening to the lake's pulse, aware of what moves beneath, and praying I am ready for the next time it calls. I've begun to notice patterns now, small and subtle but unmistakable. The lake doesn't move randomly. The lights don't dance without intent. And the forest doesn't whisper without purpose. I've come to understand that everything I see, everything I feel, is part of a conversation I didn't know I was invited to, a dialogue I cannot refuse. It started one evening when the sun dipped beneath the horizon and the mist rolled off the lake like smoke from a fire that never burns out. I was alone on patrol, the usual staff having gone home for the evening, the station locked and silent behind me. My boots crunched softly on the frost-dusted trail, and I could feel the cold settling into my joints, seeping into the marrow of my bones. The air smelled of pine and something else, something older, almost metallic, that I could not place. I knew instinctively that tonight would be different. By the time I reached the southern inlet, the lake was already alive. Blue lights hovered above the surface, flickering in patterns that seemed deliberate. I froze at the edge of the water, heart hammering, hands gripping the strap of my flashlight. The lights pulsed, synchronized, and then, just as suddenly, a single orb detached and moved toward me. Not above the water, not floating, but gliding, smooth, silent, purposeful. I felt the heat of fear in my chest as it approached. My radio lay forgotten in my pack, my voice lodged in my throat, and then the water moved beneath it, a ripple, a swell, and for the first time I saw the shape clearly. Not a shadow, not a reflection, but something massive and white, rippling beneath the surface, its contours vague, but its size undeniable. The lake itself seemed to bow to it, the water folding around its form in a way that defied logic. I wanted to step back, to run, but my feet were rooted, my mind suspended between disbelief and the raw, impossible reality in front of me. The orb hovered over the water, a perfect sphere of cold blue, and for a moment I thought it was a warning, a signal. Then, a sound unlike anything I've ever heard erupted from the depths, low, guttural, reverberating through the air and into my chest. It was not language, not noise, but something older, something primordial. It shook the air around me, the forest shivering as if it too had felt it. I fell backward, hands gripping the dirt, the lights above me responding to my movement, flickering faster, brighter. The sound grew louder, vibrating through my teeth, my skull, my very bones. And in that instant, I understood something terrifying. The lake was alive. Not alive in the sense of fish or mammals, not in the sense of trees or plants, but alive in awareness, in intent. And it was curious about me. I scrambled to my feet, fleeing along the narrow trail that hugged the shoreline, but every step brought the wisp closer, carried on the wind, soft and mournful. I felt them in the mist curling around my legs, the frost forming in the hollows of my jacket, the cold that burned and licked at my skin. I turned back once, and the lake was black again, perfectly calm, the lights gone. But the ripple remained, a subtle wave that radiated outward, as if mocking my fear. The next morning, frost coated my boots, and the edges of the trail where I had lain, pressed into delicate crystalline patterns that no natural process could explain. My colleagues asked if I had slipped, fallen, or perhaps overexerted myself. I said nothing. What could I say? That the lake had watched me, that the lights had followed, that the water itself had tested me? Words could not convey the sensation of presence, of being observed by something so vast, so deliberate. It made your instincts revolt against your own reason. Days passed. Patrols continued. Campers reported strange phenomena, voices echoing across the water, lights flickering in impossible sequences, the sudden appearance of frost even on warm nights. Every report I logged, every photograph I took made the fear within me grow. And still the lake called. Every evening I felt it, the pull, the tug in my chest drawing me to the edge of the water. I could not resist. One night, I prepared for what I hoped would be understanding. I loaded my small boat with equipment, cameras, infrared sensors, every device I thought might document, capture, or explain. I pushed off into the water, the oars cutting silently through the icy surface, and waited. The lake responded with perfect patience. First, a ripple. Then, the familiar pulse of blue light, faint at first, then intensifying. And then the shadow. It rose beneath the water, just beyond the reach of the boat, enormous and pale, its form obscured but unmistakable. The water bent around it, curling unnaturally, folding as if physics itself had surrendered to this presence. I reached for the radio, for my voice, but my mouth refused to form words. My heart hammered, my breath caught, and in that perfect silence, I realized I had been wrong about everything. This was not a creature to be observed. It was not something to be confronted. It was awareness incarnate, the lake's memory and will given form. It was older than human fear, more patient than human reasoning, and infinitely more curious than I dared imagine. And then the lights converged. Hundreds of orbs, swirling in impossible patterns above the water, forming shapes and angles that burned in my vision. They pulsed in tandem with the shadow beneath, a symphony of presence and motion that I could not understand. My hands trembled on the oars, but I did not row. I could not. The lake itself seemed to suspend me in place, time and gravity warped by something ancient and deliberate. I felt it brush the boat, a sensation unlike any I've ever experienced. Not cold, not wet, but alive, conscious, pressing against me in recognition. The water beneath me swelled, and for a fleeting moment I thought I would be pulled under. My instincts screamed, my body shook, my mind teetered on the edge of collapse, and yet the shadow did not attack. It observed, it waited, it taught. Hours passed, minutes, or perhaps seconds. Time no longer held meaning. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the lights dissipated, the shadow receded, and the lake returned to its black reflective surface. My boat floated alone in silence. I dared to glance around. The forest stood still, frost glinting faintly in the moonlight, as if nothing had occurred. I returned to shore at dawn, hands frozen, knees shaking, and the frost coated everything. My boots, the boat, the oars, even the edge of the trail where I stepped. I left the cameras, the sensors, everything behind. There was no evidence that would satisfy reason, no proof that would convince anyone of what I had experienced. Only the memory of the pulse, the presence, the awareness that had stared at me, evaluated me, and found me wanting. That was the first time I understood fully what it means to be at Crater Lake. You do not protect it, you do not conquer it, you survive it, you endure it, you witness it. And when it calls, you answer, not because you are brave, not because you are curious, but because the alternative is unthinkable. Since then, I have learned to move differently, to listen, to feel, to anticipate. The lake tests me nightly, the lights watch, the shadows wait, and every now and then, in the deepest silence, I feel the brush of frost against my cheek or hear a whisper just behind me, and I am reminded, I am not alone. I am not in control. I am a part of something older than me, larger than me, and utterly indifferent to my understanding. And yet, even in this terror, there is beauty. The precision of the lights, the fluidity of the shadow beneath the water, the way the mist curls over the lake at dawn, it is all breathtaking. I have learned to watch without hoping to intervene, to observe without expectation, to endure without complaint. The fear has become a companion, a teacher, a force that sharpens my perception and forces me to confront the limits of my reason. I do not know how long I will remain here, how many nights I can continue to face the lake and its impossible lights without losing more of myself. But I do know this: I will continue to answer its call. I will continue to patrol, to record, to endure, because survival is not about understanding. Survival is about presence, awareness, respect. And if the lake demands it, so be it. I am no longer the ranger who arrived at Crater Lake, confident and prepared. That man is gone, dissolved in frost and shadow. I am something else now, wary, alert, aware, and infinitely cautious. And each night, when the mist rises and the lights pulse above the water, I am reminded of the truth I cannot escape. At Crater Lake, reason is fragile, fear is real, and the darkness is always watching. The nights have a rhythm now, one I cannot escape, one that has become part of me whether I like it or not. Every evening, as the sun dips below the horizon and the first mists begin to curl off the lake, I feel it in my chest, a tug, subtle at first, then insistent, drawing me toward the water. I know what awaits me there. I know the lights, the shadows, the pulse of something beneath the surface that is alive in a way no human could understand. And yet, I cannot resist. It was during one of these nights, colder than any before, the frost biting through my boots and gloves, that I realized just how much I had changed. I no longer approached the lake with the confidence I had once carried, the unshakable belief that training and reason could protect me. That man is gone. In his place is someone smaller, perhaps, but more aware, someone who has learned to listen when the forest whispers, to watch when the lights shimmer, to feel when the lake moves. I am no longer a ranger here to protect. I am a witness, a participant, a messenger. I pushed off in the boat, oars cutting through the ice-thin water, every muscle taut, every nerve alert. The lake was black and still, a perfect mirror, reflecting the stars that barely pierced the mist. And then I saw them, the blue lights. They flickered at first, distant, teasing, then grew brighter, moving as one, forming shapes I could not name, patterns that seemed alive. My hands gripped the oars so tightly that I thought my knuckles might break. Then the shadow rose. Larger than anything I had imagined, a white, flowing mass beneath the water, moving with impossible fluidity. It was closer than ever, the water curling around it as though the lake itself had given it form. I could feel the presence pressing against me, testing me, aware of every heartbeat, every shallow breath. And for the first time, I stopped fighting. I stopped rowing. I simply floated, letting the lake hold me, letting the lights dance, letting the shadow observe. It lingered there, immense and patient. The blue lights swirled around the boat, pulsing in time with the shadow below, as if acknowledging my surrender. And then the hum began, low and resonant, vibrating through the boat, through my bones, through the frost that had settled on my jacket. The lake was speaking, not in words, but in sensation, in presence, in awareness. I had no choice but to listen. Hours or minutes, I cannot say which, passed. The lights began to separate, some moving outward toward the distant tree line, others remaining above the water, hovering like watchful eyes. The shadow beneath the surface shifted as well, circling, testing, moving in ways that defied any rational understanding. I felt neither fear nor relief, only awe. The lake had stripped me of everything I thought I knew, leaving only presence, only observation, only a fragile awareness of my place in this vast, unknowable system. And then suddenly it all stopped. The lights vanished, the shadow receded, and the lake was black and still once more. I sat in the boat, hands numb, body trembling, staring at the surface and feeling the frost forming once again on the oars and hull. The air was impossibly still, the mist curling and lifting, and for a moment I thought I was alone. But I was not. I returned to shore at dawn, exhausted in a way that sleep cannot cure, yet profoundly alive in a way I had never experienced before. The frost coated my boots and the edge of the trail, delicate crystalline patterns that defied explanation, evidence of what had occurred. No photograph, no recording, no sensor could capture it fully. The lake and whatever inhabited it was beyond technology, beyond comprehension, beyond reason. In the days that followed, I walked the trails differently. I moved with care, with awareness, with a respect that bordered on reverence. The campers noticed, commented, asked questions. I told them little, keeping my words neutral, professional. But in the privacy of my mind, I rehearsed every encounter, every observation, every sensation. I documented them meticulously, not for proof, not for recognition, but for survival, for understanding myself, for acknowledging that I had glimpsed something that could neither be contained nor explained. The forest, the lake, the lights, they all became teachers. Each sound, each shift in mist, each ripple in the water was a lesson. I learned patience. I learned observation. I learned that fear is not weakness, but a signal, a guide, a means of survival. The lake does not punish recklessly. It tests, it watches, it waits. And if you are present, if you are aware, if you respect it, it allows you to endure. I began to notice subtler phenomena, footsteps in the frost that ended abruptly, shadows moving just beyond the tree line, whispers that were neither threatening nor comforting, but insistently present. I no longer tried to rationalize these experiences. I accepted them. They became part of the rhythm of life at Crater Lake, as much as the wind, the mist, the scent of pine, and the pulse of the water. And yet, despite the awe, there is still terror. The lake is patient, but not merciful. The shadow beneath the water is not my friend. The lights above are not playful. They are aware, intelligent, vast, and indifferent. And every encounter leaves a mark, a frost that burns and whispers that linger in the mind long after the mist has lifted. It was during one of these quiet nights, sitting at the edge of the lake and watching the frost form on the oars, that I understood the full weight of what I had experienced. I realized that the lights, the shadow, the lake, they were not just phenomena to be observed. They were a mirror reflecting the limits of my reason, the fragility of certainty, the thin veneer of control that I had carried like armor. And in that reflection, I saw myself, not as a ranger, not as a protector, but as a human being, profoundly small, deeply aware, and incredibly vulnerable. The lake demands presence. It demands honesty. It demands humility. And I have learned slowly, painfully, to offer it all. My confidence has been shattered, my certainty eroded. I am no longer in control, and yet in surrendering that control, I have discovered something essential: awareness, presence, endurance. I continue to patrol the lake, to row into the mist like to watch the lights and shadows, to document, to endure. I do not approach the water with hope nor with fear. I approach it with understanding, respect, awareness. And each night, when the first mists rise and the blue lights shimmer across the surface, I am reminded of what it means to exist in this world. Fragile, mortal, profoundly aware of forces beyond comprehension. I have come to understand that my role at Crater Lake is not to protect, not to conquer, not to control. It is to witness, to endure, to survive, and to respect. The lake is older than fear, older than reason, older than humanity itself. And the lights, the shadows, the pulse beneath the water, they are its voice, its memory, its presence. And perhaps that is all I can hope for, to exist within the awareness of something greater, to acknowledge its reality, to endure its presence, and to emerge somehow intact, not unscathed, but aware. Because the lake is patient. And I have learned to be patient too. I do not know how many more nights I will face the lights, how many more encounters I will endure, how much frost will form on my boots and hands before I am called further, deeper, or perhaps claimed. But I do know this: I will continue. I will observe. I will endure. And I will remain aware, because awareness is the only protection, the only path, the only salvation. The lake waits. The lights shimmer. The shadows move beneath. And I, fragile, mortal, aware, continue to answer. It was the night I understood fully that the lake would never release me. not in the way I had once imagined. The air was colder than I had ever felt, the frost thick on the boat, glinting under the moonlight like shattered glass. I had pushed out into the center of the lake alone, as I always did, but something in the air felt different, heavier, charged. The mist swirled with purpose, coiling like serpents around the bow. And then I saw them, the lights. Hundreds of them, hovering, swirling, moving in patterns that no human mind could decode. My first instinct was fear. My second instinct was rationalization. Surely, I thought, this could be explained. Drones, reflections, hallucinations, sleep deprivation. But the shadow beneath the water shattered all reason. It rose, massive, white, fluid, larger than any boat, any man, any known creature. The water bowed around it, folding in impossible shapes. It had been waiting, I realized, for me to come this far, for me to witness fully, for me to understand the extent of its presence. I gripped the oars and felt the boat resist, not as if stuck in mud, but as if something immense pressed against it, deliberate, aware. The lights above shimmered, I pulsing in time with the shadow, and the hum began. Low, vibrating, echoing through the bones of my hands, the frost biting into my fingers, the mist curling around me like a cloak. It was a voice older than humanity, speaking in the language of presence, of weight, of inevitability. I tried to row back. The lake refused. The mist thickened, and in the blur of frost and moonlight, I thought I saw figures moving along the shoreline, shadows bending in ways that should have been impossible. And then the water beneath me surged. Not violently, not angrily, but with awareness, testing, enveloping. I felt it brush against the hull, against my legs, against the very fibers of my being. Panic rose. My training told me to react, to escape, to survive. But the instinct that had carried me for years, reason, was useless here. The lake demanded surrender, and I felt it in my chest, in my lungs, in my spine. I realized then that the fear I had carried for weeks, months, years was not something to overcome. It was something to observe, to respect, to endure. Only by accepting its presence could I survive. I let go. I ceased struggling. The oars rested on the boat's edge. The frost burned my palms, but I did not move. The lights above pulsed, circling, expanding, contracting. The shadow beneath twisted and flowed with the water, immense and patient. And in that instant, I understood that my life, my mind, my body were inconsequential to the lake. Only presence mattered. Awareness, respect, endurance, time lost meaning. The lake held me in its pulse, its hum, its cold. And then gradually the shadow descended, swirling beneath me, brushing the boat gently, almost as if acknowledging my submission. The lights above shimmered, not threatening, not playful, but intelligent, deliberate. I could feel them measuring, evaluating, like recognizing that I had come to understand their world, even if only in a fragmentary, terrified way. I closed my eyes, shivering in the frost, and when I opened them again, the lake was calm. The lights flickered once, twice, and then vanished into the mist. The shadow retreated, dissolving into the depths, leaving only black water, silver moonlight, and the faint curling of fog across the surface. I sat in silence, gripping the boat's edge, feeling the frost settle on my clothes, on my skin, and finally allowed myself to exhale. I returned to shore as the first light of dawn painted the lake in muted gold. Frost coated my boots, the trail, even the edges of my pack, delicate crystalline patterns that defied explanation. No one would believe what had happened. No photograph, no recording, no log entry could capture the depth, the awareness, the presence of what I had witnessed. And yet I did not care. I had survived. Not through courage or skill, not through rationality, but through surrender, through awareness, through presence. I walked the forest differently after that night. Every step became deliberate. Every sound, every shadow, every ripple on the lake's surface was noted, observed, respected. I began to feel the forest as one entity, the lake as one mind, the lights as its voice. I no longer patrolled with the hope of control. I patrolled with the awareness that the world I had once thought I could manage was far larger, far older, far more intelligent than I could comprehend. Campers continued to report strange phenomena, and I recorded them meticulously. Lights flickering over the lake, shadows at the tree line, frost appearing even in warm weather, whispers carried on the wind. I did not rationalize these events anymore. I accepted them. They were part of the rhythm of Crater Lake, as much as the trees, the mist, the wind, and the pulse of the water. And then one night, months later, I realized something profound. The fear that had driven me, the terror that had twisted my stomach, clenched my hands, burned in my chest, was no longer paralyzing. It had become a companion, a teacher, a guide. The lights and the frost and the mist, the pulse of the lake itself, they were not enemies. They were reminders of fragility, of mortality, of presence, and of awareness. I understood that Crater Lake does not need me to believe in it. It exists as it always has, as it always will. The lights above, the shadow beneath, the frost that forms where logic cannot reach, they are all part of it. And I am a part of it too. Not in power, not in control, but in awareness, in surrender, in endurance. I sometimes see the blue lights from the station, flickering over the distant tree line, shimmering in patterns I can never fully interpret. I hear the hum in the wind, feel the pulse of the water beneath the oars, and I smile quietly to myself. I have learned the lessons of the lake. I have survived the tests. I have endured. And though I may never fully understand, I know that I am alive, and in some strange, terrible way, that is enough. I do not tell visitors what lies beneath the surface. I do not speak of the shadow or the frost, the lights or the hum. There are no words that can convey it, no recording that can capture it. Only presence matters, and only awareness can guide one through it. And I have learned to be aware. The lake waits, the lights shimmer, the shadow moves beneath, and I am there, fragile, mortal, aware. Not unscathed, not triumphant, but present. I have become something else, not the confident ranger who arrived, maps in hand, full of certainty, not the man who believed he could rationalize the world. I am smaller now, wiser, more aware. And in that awareness, I have found survival. Crater Lake will always be there, as it has always been. The lights will always shimmer, the shadow will always move beneath, and I will continue to patrol, to witness, to endure. Because to be aware is to survive, to exist is to learn, and to respect is to endure. And so I row each night into the mist, into the pulse of the lake, knowing that fear is not the enemy. Reason is not the shield. Presence is the only protection, and endurance is the only path. The lights will call, the shadow will rise, and the lake will teach its lessons again and again. I am ready. I am aware. I endure.